The remote wilderness of a northern peninsula, famed for its untouched beauty, was home to a sprawling nature preserve known for dense forests, rushing rivers, and an abundance of brown bears. This secluded region had long been a sanctuary for nature enthusiasts, and it was here in the heart of the wilderness that the Vorontsov family, Mikhail, Anastasia, and their children, Dmitry and Svetlana, had chosen to spend their spring vacation. Seeking refuge from city life, they hoped to find peace and rejuvenation in the serene isolation of nature, away from the stress of everyday life. The Vorontsovs were experienced in outdoor adventures. Mikhail, a 42-year-old geologist, had spent years conducting field research across the region, becoming intimately familiar with its rugged terrain. Anastasia, 39, worked as an environmental consultant, deeply invested in preserving the area's natural beauty. Their children, Dmitry, 14, and Svetlana, 11, had grown up respecting nature and had accompanied their parents on numerous backcountry trips. This trip was meant to deepen their bond with the wilderness, a place where they all found solace. They arrived at their campsite 3 days earlier, setting up along the banks of a fast-moving river. The site was idyllic, a clearing surrounded by birch and pine trees, with the river offering both a soothing backdrop and essential water. The first few days passed in quiet bliss, with hikes, photography, and stargazing under the open sky, a peaceful escape from the daily grind. Evenings were spent around the campfire, with stories and laughter that echoed in the cool night air. On the morning of May 8th, 2025, the family rose before dawn. The sky was dark, and a light fog hung over the land, typical of the region's spring mornings. Their plan was simple: cross the river to explore a set of unusual rock formations Mikhail had discovered the day before and gather firewood. The weather was crisp and foggy, lending an almost otherworldly atmosphere to the early morning hours. Around 5:30 a.m., the Vorontsovs began crossing the river at a shallow point 50 meters from their camp. They didn't know that an unusually large male brown bear, weighing over 800 pounds, had been drawn to their campsite by the scent of their evening meal and food stored inside their tent. The bear, an older and hungry animal, had been roaming the area in search of food and detected the family's camp from a distance, its senses sharpened by hunger. Gavril Popov, a local fisherman, was working a half-kilometer downstream when he heard terrified screams cutting through the morning fog. Without hesitation, he abandoned his fishing gear and rushed toward the sound. Reaching a vantage point by the river, he witnessed the horrifying scene unfold before him. The bear charged into the water, first striking Mikhail and knocking him into the current. It then turned its attention to Anastasia, who was desperately trying to guide her children back toward the shore. The combined force of the river's swift current and the bear's savage attack proved too much for the family. Popov, paralyzed by fear, could only watch in helpless horror as the bear dragged each family member across the river, seemingly with methodical precision. Attempts to intervene were futile. Popov retreated to higher ground, where he managed to get cell phone reception and contacted emergency services. By the time help arrived, it was already too late. He later described the bear's behavior as disturbingly deliberate, noting that it re-entered the water multiple times to drag the family members with terrifying precision. A regional emergency response team arrived by helicopter 2 hours later. Though the campsite appeared untouched, investigators soon found a disturbance trail leading 200 meters into the woods. Tragically, all 4 members of the Vorontsov family were found dead. The cause of death was a combination of drowning and fatal injuries from the animal attack. The bear's actions caused deadly injuries, while the river's strong current contributed to the tragedy. Wildlife officials quickly mobilized a search team to locate and neutralize the bear, fearing its behavior indicated it had begun targeting humans, a rare shift in brown bear behavior. The bear was located that afternoon 3 kilometers from the campsite, hidden in dense brush. Pavel Zhukov, the lead wildlife officer, took the necessary action to end the bear's life. A necropsy revealed that the bear was an older male, around 18 years old, with multiple broken teeth and signs of prolonged nutritional stress. Experts believed its aggression could have been triggered by a particularly harsh winter that had depleted local food sources, leaving the bear desperate for food and likely drawn to the family's camp. In the wake of the incident, the nature preserve was temporarily closed to the public. Authorities implemented stricter safety measures, including mandatory bear-resistant food containers and increased ranger patrols during peak seasons. The tragedy served as a painful reminder of the unpredictable dangers of venturing into wilderness areas, especially those inhabited by large predators. To honor the Vorontsovs, several conservation organizations established the Vorontsov Wilderness Safety Initiative. This program aimed to educate hikers, campers, and outdoor enthusiasts about respecting wildlife and following best practices for coexisting with predators in the wild, hoping to prevent future tragedies. Gavril Popov, the fisherman who witnessed the attack, never returned to fish in the area. Months later, in interviews with local media, he spoke about the haunting experience, admitting that the screams of that tragic morning continued to echo in his mind. He described the overwhelming helplessness he felt as he watched the devastating events unfold. For Popov, and for all who knew the Vorontsovs, the tragedy served as an unforgettable lesson in the fragility of life and the unpredictable forces of nature. His voice, though steady, still carried the weight of that morning's horrors, a burden that would stay with him forever. Tom had driven logging trucks through the remote northern wilderness for nearly 20 years. Rough, steady, and as tough as the landscape itself, he was no stranger to the dangers of hauling massive loads through isolated forest roads. On May 22, 2025, he found himself deep in the wilds of an island where nature still ruled and humans tread lightly. The region was known for its dense berry patches, a critical food source for the island's massive native bears. Immense, powerful creatures with reputations as unpredictable as the shifting weather. Tom was in his mid-40s, broad-shouldered and weather-beaten, with a calm demeanor forged by decades on the road. That afternoon, his logging truck rumbled along a narrow, gravel-lined path cutting through thick spruce and alder. The engine had been acting up all morning, sputtering and coughing as if struggling to breathe. Suddenly, just as he rounded a sharp bend, the engine died completely. The truck rolled to a stop beside a lush patch of ripe berries. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by distant bird calls and the faint rustle of wind in the trees. Frustrated, Tom shut off the ignition and climbed down from the cab. His boots sank slightly into the soft, mossy ground as he approached the hood, intent on diagnosing the problem. The engine hissed faintly as it cooled, and Tom reached for his toolbox, scanning his surroundings. The berry patch stretched several yards, the bushes heavy with dark purple fruit. He was aware these berries attracted bears, but he hadn't seen any fresh tracks or signs nearby. Unbeknownst to him, a massive bear was feeding just 20 meters away. Its thick fur shimmered in the dappled light, and its enormous shoulders hunched as it tore handfuls of berries with powerful jaws. The animal was a giant, easily standing 8 feet tall when upright, with curved claws and eyes filled with fierce intelligence. It appeared absorbed in its meal and seemingly unaware of Tom's presence. Tom worked quickly, checking hoses and wires under the hood. Then the atmosphere changed. The bird calls ceased, and a heavy silence settled over the forest. A chill ran down his spine as unease crept into his chest. Moments later, the bear's head rose sharply, its eyes locking on Tom. For a heartbeat, the world stood still. The bear rose to its full height with terrifying speed, unleashing a guttural growl that echoed like thunder through the trees. Tom froze, heart pounding. He barely had time to react before the massive creature charged, its powerful limbs thundering against the earth. Tom stumbled backward, but the bear closed the distance with frightening speed. With a violent swipe, it knocked him off his feet, sending him crashing to the ground beside the truck. Pain tore through his leg as claws shredded both fabric and flesh. The animal's teeth sank into his calf with crushing force. Driven by sheer survival instinct, Tom crawled desperately toward the truck's door. Every movement was agony, and blood blurred his vision. Still, he managed to grip the door handle and wrench it open just as the bear prepared to strike again. He slammed the door shut and locked it, gasping for breath as the truck's frame became his only shield. Outside, the bear circled the vehicle, pounding the metal with massive paws. The noise shook the cab and rattled Tom's nerves. It growled low, its breath steaming in the cool air. After circling once more, the bear eventually turned and lumbered away into the thick forest, leaving Tom bloodied but alive. Time passed slowly as Tom sat trembling, fighting the pain and trying to stay alert. He reached for his radio and called for help, his voice weak but steady. Within the hour, a rescue team arrived, and he was airlifted by helicopter to the nearest hospital. Doctors found deep wounds, torn muscle, and crushed bone in his left leg. He would survive, but the road to recovery would be long. The attack left more than physical wounds. Tom's experience drew attention to the growing conflict between human industry and native wildlife habitats in isolated regions. As logging operations pushed deeper into once untouched forests, encounters with large predators had become more frequent and far less predictable. Wildlife experts pointed to the incident as evidence of a broader ecological issue. Animals that once roamed vast, undisturbed territories were now forced into shrinking habitats, their food sources increasingly shared with or disrupted by humans. The berry patches, once peaceful feeding grounds, were now flashpoints of conflict between industry and nature. Tom's experience was a stark example of how sudden and violent the response from the wild could be when provoked by human encroachment. In the weeks following the incident, the logging company implemented new safety protocols, including mandatory wildlife awareness training. Tom, once just a driver, became an advocate for education and coexistence. He began sharing his story in meetings and interviews, urging both workers and decision-makers to take bear behavior and habitat preservation seriously. Though his body healed slowly, his outlook on the wilderness changed more profoundly. Tom never blamed the bear. He recognized it as a territorial animal reacting to intrusion, not as a villain. The incident revealed how thin and fragile the line was between civilization and the untamed world. One misstep could turn a routine day into a life-threatening encounter. As Tom recovered, he gained a deeper sense of humility and caution. The logging truck that had nearly become his coffin was eventually repaired and returned to service. Still, the memory of that day lingered, the moment when the forest reminded him of its power. The bear had shown him the unforgiving strength of the wild, and Tom had survived to share that truth. Survival in these lands required respect, not just preparation. Kodiak Island, the second largest island in the United States, had long been known for its breathtaking beauty and notoriously unpredictable wilderness. Home to the largest subspecies of brown bear in the world, the island's 3,600 square miles of rugged terrain had attracted adventurers, scientists, and outdoor enthusiasts for generations, despite, or perhaps because of, the inherent risks of sharing the landscape with such formidable wildlife. Its untouched expanses offered a sense of isolation and freedom, but also carried the undeniable dangers of the wild, where every encounter with nature could turn unexpectedly dangerous. On the morning of September 12, 2022, Lieutenant Thaddeus Montgomery and his Coast Guard crew were conducting a routine training flight over the northeastern portion of the island. The helicopter crew, based at Coast Guard Air Station Kodiak, had been practicing search and rescue techniques in preparation for the approaching winter, when severe weather conditions often created dangerous situations for mariners and hikers alike. The crew was well prepared for emergencies, but nothing could have prepared them for what they would encounter on this flight. While flying over a remote valley approximately 28 miles from the nearest road, Lieutenant Montgomery spotted something unusual, a bright blue tent that appeared to be damaged, with someone waving urgently beside it. His sharp eyes immediately noted the distress signal. Without hesitation, he directed his co-pilot, Ensign Veronica Walsh, to circle back for a closer inspection. The crew confirmed that a person was indeed signaling for help, and quickly identified a small clearing about 50 yards away where they could safely land. Following standard wilderness rescue procedures, Lieutenant Montgomery and Petty Officer Zachariah Reynolds disembarked, while Ensign Walsh remained at the controls. The two rescuers moved cautiously, fully aware that the situation could involve hidden dangers. The man, who now appeared visibly injured, continued waving and pointing frantically behind them. It was clear that something more than a simple injury was at play. Unbeknownst to the crew, a massive Kodiak bear had been stalking the campsite for hours. Concealed in thick brush less than 20 yards from the landing site, it had likely been drawn in by the scent of blood from the prior day's violent events. The bear had been observing the camp from afar, patiently waiting for the right moment to strike. As the rescuers neared the hiker, the bear exploded from its hiding place with terrifying speed. Petty Officer Reynolds, walking slightly ahead, was the first to be struck, knocked to the ground with overwhelming force. Lieutenant Montgomery instinctively reached for his sidearm, but fearing he might accidentally hit Reynolds, instead deployed a signal flare directly at the animal. The sudden burst of light and smoke startled the bear, creating a brief window of opportunity. Montgomery seized the moment, grabbing his injured crewmate and dragging him back toward the helicopter, his eyes never leaving the bear. From the cockpit, Ensign Walsh radioed for immediate backup and medical evacuation. The hiker, later identified as Dr. Harrington Blackwood, a geology researcher from Princeton University, managed to make it to the aircraft moments later, covered in blood and visibly trembling from both injury and extreme shock. Once airborne, Dr. Blackwood revealed the grim details of what had happened. He and his research partner, Dr. Elias Thornfield, had been camping in the area for 3 days while collecting soil samples for a climate study. The morning before the incident, they had noticed bear tracks near the site, but had made the decision to continue their work, believing they had taken proper precautions with food storage and bear spray. They hadn't anticipated that a bear would be drawn to their camp with such deadly intent. That night, the bear had silently approached the tent, circling for hours before launching a sudden and violent attack. Dr. Thornfield attempted to use his bear spray but was overtaken before he could deploy it effectively. Dr. Blackwood later described how he had been forced to hide beneath their research equipment, paralyzed with fear and unable to intervene, as the bear fatally mauled his colleague and dragged the body a short distance from camp. The bear returned to the site multiple times throughout the day, seemingly guarding the area and preventing Blackwood from fleeing. Only when he heard the sound of an approaching helicopter did Blackwood risk exposing himself to signal for help. As the aircraft lifted off with both the wounded petty officer and the traumatized researcher on board, the bear was seen returning to the area near the shredded tent. Several hours later, additional Coast Guard and Alaska Wildlife Trooper teams arrived to recover Dr. Thornfield's remains and initiate a search for the bear, which had vanished into the dense wilderness, leaving nothing but fear in its wake. A subsequent investigation identified the animal as a mature male that had been tagged during a wildlife study 3 years earlier. Biologists theorized that the bear had developed an unusually aggressive pattern of behavior, possibly driven by prolonged food scarcity or past negative interactions with humans that had reduced its natural caution. This bear had become dangerous, its instincts altered by circumstances beyond the ordinary. Petty Officer Reynolds survived after undergoing multiple surgeries, though he was left with permanent nerve damage in his left arm. Lieutenant Montgomery was awarded a Coast Guard Commendation Medal for his quick thinking and bravery under extreme pressure. Dr. Blackwood eventually recovered physically, but continued to experience lasting trauma from the event. He chose not to return to field research, instead focusing on laboratory work and advocating for improved safety protocols for wilderness scientists. He hoped that his experience would spur changes that could prevent others from suffering as he had. The tragedy prompted a thorough review of safety guidelines for those working in remote areas of Kodiak Island. Recommendations were updated to emphasize the importance of traveling in pairs or groups, carrying multiple types of deterrents, and utilizing more reliable communication equipment. For the close-knit community of researchers operating in Alaska's backcountry, the incident served as a grim reminder of how quickly the awe-inspiring wilderness could turn perilous. Despite an extensive effort, the bear that had stalked Dr. Blackwood and taken Dr. Thornfield's life was never found, leaving an unresolved shadow over the land and the researchers who dared to explore it. Ethan was a wildlife photographer driven by passion and patience. In his late 20s, with sharp eyes behind a camera and a quiet, determined nature, he pursued moments few ever witnessed, images of Kodiak bears in their prime, feeding along the salmon-rich streams of Alaska's remote island wilderness. On May 15, 1995, he and his guide, Mark, ventured deep into the dense terrain of Kodiak Island, intent on capturing the early salmon run and the bears that followed it. Mark, a seasoned outdoorsman in his early 40s, knew the island well. He was familiar with its unforgiving terrain and the unpredictable behavior of its massive bears. His years in the wild had taught him caution and respect, lessons he tried to pass on to Ethan, reminding him that in bear country, the line between observer and intruder could vanish in an instant. The two men moved carefully, navigating through thick forest and over rocky ridges, following the path of salmon upstream. On their second day, they found a promising spot along a swift-moving river, where the water churned red with spawning fish. The air was damp and cool, heavy with the scent of wet earth and pine. Ethan, eager to find the perfect angle, ventured ahead alone, camera in hand, eyes scanning the shoreline for a glimpse of bear activity. Unbeknownst to him, a dominant male Kodiak bear was already nearby, massive, battle-scarred, and watching. The bear lay low among the brush, keenly aware of its surroundings. It was the undisputed ruler of this stretch of river, and anything unfamiliar in its territory could be perceived as a threat. Earlier that morning, Ethan had flown a drone to scout the riverbank, looking for prime vantage points. The buzzing machine had flown low, skimming the treetops and disturbing the natural quiet. The noise had unsettled the bear, stirring unease and irritation. Though it hadn't reacted immediately, the intrusion had left a mark, a rising tension beneath its calm. As Ethan moved unknowingly downwind of the bear, he advanced too quickly and too close. The uneven terrain, a tangle of moss-covered rocks and fallen branches, made it difficult to remain silent or to retreat easily. From his position farther back, Mark noticed the shift in the bear's posture and shouted a warning, but his voice was muffled by the roar of the river and the thick foliage. Then, the bear charged. Its speed was terrifying. In seconds, it covered the short distance between itself and Ethan, who had just registered movement in the brush when the bear was upon him. He dropped his camera and turned to flee, but the rough ground slowed him, his boots slipping on the wet earth. The bear reached him in moments, its massive jaws clamped around Ethan's torso with staggering force, driving him to the ground. The silence of the wilderness shattered with the sound of breaking branches and the muffled impact of the struggle. Ethan fought, scrambling and twisting, but the bear's strength was overwhelming. It bit and struck with primal fury, likely reacting not just to his presence, but to the earlier disturbance caused by the drone. Mark sprinted toward the scene, heart pounding, radio in hand. He saw the bear pause, momentarily distracted by Mark's sudden approach, then vanish into the forest, slipping into the shadows as quickly as it had appeared. Mark reached Ethan's side and radioed for rescue, describing the attack and their location with urgent precision. Hours passed before teams arrived, navigating dense brush and uneven ground to reach them. When they finally did, they found Ethan gravely injured, motionless among the branches and blood-stained soil. Despite their efforts, he had not survived. The tragedy left an impact far beyond the isolated riverbank. Investigators later concluded that the drone had agitated the bear earlier in the day, contributing to its heightened aggression. Wildlife experts pointed to the incident as a stark warning. In wilderness areas, especially during critical feeding periods, small disturbances can have unpredictable and deadly consequences. The story made waves within both the wildlife photography community and the broader public. It reignited debate around the use of drones in natural habitats and led to renewed calls for stricter guidelines and education for those working in close proximity to large predators. Mark carried the weight of the experience long after the forest fell silent again. Ethan had been more than just a client. He was a young man fueled by awe and creativity, chasing beauty in its rawest form. The photo he had hoped to capture would never exist, replaced instead by the memory of a life cut short in the pursuit of it. The attack became a solemn lesson in the fragile balance between humanity and the wild. Kodiak Island, with its rugged beauty and enormous bears, was not a place for careless movements or unfamiliar technology. It demanded respect, always. In time, a memorial was quietly placed near the river's edge, where salmon still swam and bears still roamed. It served as a quiet reminder of Ethan's passion, his final journey, and the enduring truth that in places untouched by roads or fences, nature's rules are absolute and unforgiving. Lake McDonald, the largest and deepest lake within a major national park in the northwestern United States, had long attracted visitors seeking the untamed beauty of alpine wilderness. Surrounded by snow-draped peaks and thick forests, the lake's icy winter surface held a quiet grandeur that appealed to a different kind of explorer, those drawn to solitude and raw nature. In March of 2019, 5 college students, Thornton Thor Westervelt, Maximilian Prentice, Augustus Blackwood, Wellington Zhao, and Bartholomew Jenkins, ventured into this frozen landscape during their final spring break before graduation. Close friends, since their first year at a regional university, the group had been planning the trip for months as part of a senior multimedia project. Their goal was to document the stark beauty of the wilderness with drone footage and still photography. Arriving at their cabin on March 21st, they spent the first day setting up and scouting locations along the lake. All 5 were seasoned outdoorsmen, raised in the rugged terrain of the Northwest, and familiar with the risks that came with venturing into remote areas. They understood the threat posed by wildlife, but they underestimated the dangers of the unseasonably warm weather that had affected the region for the past week. Park officials had posted warnings about unstable ice conditions, and the group had agreed to remain close to shore. According to survivor accounts, the first 2 days were calm and productive. They captured stunning visuals during daylight hours and reviewed their footage each night, gathered around the fireplace. Before sunrise on March 23rd, Thor Westervelt rose early, eager to capture the golden glow of dawn reflecting across the ice. He left a handwritten note for the others, gathered his drone gear, and walked to a location roughly half a mile from their cabin. Unbeknownst to him, a female grizzly and her cub had emerged prematurely from hibernation. The unusually warm temperatures had disrupted their natural cycles, leaving the bears confused, hungry, and agitated. Their den lay hidden less than 200 yards from where Thor set up for his morning shoot. Investigators later concluded that the bear likely saw Thor as a threat to her cub. Around 7:15 a.m., the rest of the group, having read Thor's note, set out to join him. As they approached, they heard distant shouts echoing across the lake. Maximilian Prentice, who led the way, reported seeing Thor sprinting across the ice, followed closely by a charging grizzly. In his terror, Thor headed toward the center of the lake rather than back to shore. The ice, already weakened by several days of above-freezing temperatures, couldn't support the combined weight and impact. Approximately 300 yards from shore, both Thor and the bear crashed through the surface into the frigid water below. The four friends watched in horror from the shoreline as Thor struggled to pull himself back onto the ice, which continued to break away under his hands. The bear, equally panicked, thrashed in the water nearby before managing to claw its way onto more solid ice and disappearing back into the forest, leaving a trail of water behind. Augustus Blackwood attempted to reach Thor, crawling cautiously over the ice, but was forced to retreat when the surface began to crack beneath him. Wellington Zhao used a drone to try to get a better view of the situation, while Bartholomew Jenkins called emergency services on their satellite phone. By the time park rangers and emergency personnel arrived 20 minutes later, Thor had disappeared beneath the surface. The water temperature was just above freezing, giving him only minutes of functional mobility before hypothermia set in. Despite the rangers' immediate response with ice rescue equipment, they were unable to locate him in the murky depths. Thor's body was recovered the following day by search and rescue divers. The medical examiner determined that the cause of death was drowning exacerbated by hypothermia, with no evidence of direct injuries from the bear itself. The bear and her cub were located later that week by wildlife officials, who decided not to euthanize the animal after determining she had not displayed predatory behavior, but had acted defensively to protect her young. The tragedy sent shockwaves through the Park Service and the wildlife management community. It represented a perfect storm of circumstances: climate change affecting hibernation patterns, human presence in sensitive wildlife areas, and the unpredictable nature of wild animal behavior. The four surviving friends established the Wilderness Safety Foundation in memory of their fallen companion. The foundation focused on educating visitors about the impacts of climate change on wildlife behavior and the importance of maintaining safe distances from all wild animals, particularly during seasonal transitions when animal behavior might be less predictable. Park officials implemented additional warnings and restrictions regarding ice safety and wildlife awareness, particularly during early spring when bears were emerging from hibernation and potentially more aggressive due to hunger and the protection of young cubs. For Maximilian, Augustus, Wellington, and Bartholomew, the events of that March morning forever changed their relationship with the wilderness they had once loved unreservedly. While they continued to advocate for conservation and responsible outdoor recreation, their perspective was now tempered by first-hand knowledge of nature's power and unpredictability. The drone footage Thor had captured that morning, which they later recovered from his equipment, became part of their multimedia project, transformed from a celebration of natural beauty into a sobering memorial to their friend, and a warning to others about respecting the wild. As a scientist who had devoted her life to studying the Arctic's fragile ecosystem, at 34 she was no stranger to harsh conditions and isolation, having spent years conducting fieldwork in some of the most remote parts of the world. Driven by a fierce passion to understand how climate change was reshaping this frozen wilderness, she set out alone in mid-July 2025 on an expedition deep into the Arctic tundra, hundreds of miles from any human settlement. That day, the weather shifted suddenly and violently. A rare summer storm rolled in, sweeping across the tundra with fierce winds that bent the sparse grasses and whipped ice patches into slick hazards. Heavy gray clouds obscured the sun, and a sharp chill settled into the air, unusual for the brief Arctic summer. Despite the deteriorating weather, Emma pressed on. She had a clear goal: reach an old Inuit cabin marked on her map, a small shelter she hoped would provide refuge from the storm, and a base to conduct her research. The cabin stood weathered and worn, its wooden frame bleached by years of sun, snow, and wind. The windows were dark, some cracked, the door heavy but intact. Emma hurried inside, pulling the door shut behind her and securing it with a sturdy bolt she found inside. The shelter was cold and musty, smelling faintly of old wood, ice, and a forgotten past. She set down her gear and tried to steady her breath, thankful for the shelter from the sudden downpour that had started outside. Unbeknownst to Emma, she was not alone. A massive polar bear had been moving nearby. It had been following the scent of a seal carcass frozen just a few hundred meters from the cabin. The bear's hunger was desperate. For days, the shrinking sea ice had pushed it farther inland, away from its traditional hunting grounds. Its keen nose picked up Emma's scent and traced it to the cabin. Driven by hunger and curiosity, the bear approached silently, moving with terrifying purpose through the whipping wind and rain. Inside the cramped cabin, Emma was unaware of the approaching danger. She checked her equipment, preparing to gather data the next morning. Suddenly, the quiet was shattered by a violent crash. The side window exploded inward with a deafening crash of shattering glass. Sharp shards flew through the air like deadly rain as the bear's enormous paw smashed through the opening. Emma's heart jumped into her throat as she scrambled backward, clutching the flare gun she always carried for emergencies. The bear swiped again, powerful muscles flexing as it battered the cabin's walls and door. The wooden frame shook with each blow, splinters raining down around her. She was trapped inside, the storm outside forgotten in the terrifying immediacy of the bear's presence. The bear circled the cabin, growling low and fierce, its hot breath steaming in the cold air. Emma crouched low, every nerve screaming with fear and adrenaline. She gripped the flare gun tightly, her arms trembling. The bear's weight and fury tested the walls, swiping violently through the shattered window. On one swipe, broken glass sliced into Emma's arm, sharp pain exploding as blood welled quickly. Minutes dragged torturously. Emma's breath came in shallow gasps, her mind racing. The storm's howl mingled with the bear's guttural roars and the violent thuds against the cabin. Her arm throbbed, a burning ache, but the flare gun remained her only hope. Then, summoning every ounce of courage, she raised the flare gun and fired a blazing projectile into the ceiling. The sudden burst of light and fire ignited a patch of old wood and dry debris. Sparks flew wildly, smoke billowed thick and choking. The bear recoiled, startled by the unexpected inferno, its growls turning to confused snarls as it took a hesitant step back. Seizing the moment, Emma backed toward the window, eyes darting for an escape or rescue. Outside, the storm still raged, but faint sounds of distant voices and flashlights pierced the darkness. Hours earlier, her camp's satellite signal had triggered an alert, prompting a search team to deploy in the severe weather. The bear, confused and wary of the fire, eventually retreated into the storm shadows. Emma collapsed near the door, exhausted, bleeding, but alive. The rescue team arrived moments later, moving carefully with tranquilizer guns and first aid. They found the cabin battered, the walls clawed and blood-stained, shards of glass everywhere. Emma was airlifted to a distant field hospital. Her arm was treated for deep lacerations and shock. Despite the trauma, she survived. Her survival was a testament to her quick thinking, resilience, and the flare gun's crucial role. Her ordeal underscored a stark and growing reality. Climate change was rapidly transforming the Arctic landscape, melting sea ice and shrinking polar bear hunting grounds. As their natural food sources disappeared, bears were forced closer to human settlements and shelters, increasing the frequency of unpredictable and dangerous encounters. Emma's harrowing experience became a chilling example of this new reality. It revealed how these apex predators, pushed by hunger and desperation, could become aggressive in ways previously rare or unseen. It was a warning to scientists, explorers, and residents alike. Human presence in the Arctic wilderness now carried more risk than ever before. The balance between man and wild was shifting. The old separations that had kept humans and polar bears apart were eroding under the relentless advance of climate change. Emma's attack was not an isolated event, but part of a troubling pattern of closer, more volatile contact between species struggling to survive. As she recovered, Emma knew her research would have to adapt. Studying the Arctic now meant more than tracking melting ice and declining seal populations. It meant understanding the human-wildlife conflicts intensifying in the tundra's changing face. The storm that had forced her into the cabin, the bear that had shattered the window, and the flare that had saved her life, all were pieces of a story far bigger than one person's struggle. They were signs of a planet in flux, a wilderness in crisis, and the dangerous new frontier of survival in a warming world. The late summer evening settled softly over the small Vermont town of Millersville. The sun dipped low behind thick stands of maple and oak, casting long shadows across the streets. Jenna, a young woman in her mid-20s, who had worked as a clerk at Millersville Grocery for nearly 3 years, was finishing her closing routine. The store was modest, rows of fresh produce, canned goods, and household essentials, but it was the heart of the community. Jenna knew most customers by name and enjoyed the quiet moments when the last few stragglers left, and she could tidy the aisles before locking the doors. As she wiped down the counters near the front entrance that night, a faint rustling caught her attention from the back parking lot. Her brow furrowed. At first, she thought it might be a stray dog or a neighborhood cat, but the sound was heavier, more deliberate. She paused and glanced out the small window behind the checkout stand. The parking lot was mostly empty, except for a few parked cars bathed in the fading light. Near the back door, something large and dark shifted among the shadows. Jenna's heart quickened as she realized it was a black bear, a young male, his thick fur glossy under the streetlight, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. The faint scent of ripe fruit and sweet berries had drawn him there. The bear seemed cautious at first, moving slowly toward the back door, which Jenna had forgotten to close tightly while bringing in a shipment earlier that day. The slightly ajar door provided an inviting gap, and the bear slipped inside without hesitation. Jenna's breath caught. She knew bears were common in the Vermont woods surrounding the town, but never had one ventured into a store before. The bear's large paws made heavy thuds on the tile floor as he entered, his dark eyes scanning the bright aisles lined with colorful fruits and vegetables. The bear ambled casually toward the produce section near the back, drawn irresistibly to the piles of apples, berries, and peaches stacked in open crates. Jenna moved cautiously behind a checkout counter, watching in awe and fear. The bear raised a massive paw and knocked over a display of apples, sending them rolling across the floor like marbles. He sniffed greedily, then grabbed handfuls of red and green fruit, stuffing them into his mouth with a crunch of skin and pulp. Despite the surreal calm of the moment, Jenna's pulse raced. The bear's low and rumbling growls vibrated like distant thunder. She knew she had to act carefully. Any sudden move might provoke him. After several minutes, she tried to guide the bear toward the exit. Stepping slowly from behind the counter, she raised her arms and made herself appear larger, hoping to intimidate it gently without startling it. The bear's head snapped up, and its eyes locked onto hers. They stared at each other for a tense heartbeat. Predator and human, worlds apart yet in the same space. Then, unexpectedly, the bear growled sharply and charged. Jenna stumbled backward, crashing into a canned goods display, rattling loudly but did not fall. She caught herself just in time, heart pounding wildly. The bear stopped inches away, sniffing the air between them, nostrils flaring. It seemed more startled than angry. Jenna backed away carefully, retreating toward a narrow corridor near the storage rooms. She knew that corner was safe, away from the main floor and near the back exit. Once behind a sturdy metal shelf, she pulled out her phone with trembling hands and dialed animal control. Her voice was low but steady as she explained the situation and requested immediate assistance. Minutes passed like hours. The bear, meanwhile, continued to roam the aisles, knocking over more displays and pawing at cartons of berries. Its movements were restless but not frantic, as if it were both curious and confused by the strange surroundings. Outside, distant sirens wailed, and the muffled voices of officers approached. The bear's ears twitched, nostrils flaring again. Slowly, it turned toward the open back door, lured by the noises and smells beyond. In a final glance back at the scattered fruit and toppled displays, the bear lumbered toward freedom and vanished into the night. Jenna exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her hands shook as she stepped out from her hiding place, carefully surveying the wreckage left behind. The store was messy, fruit crushed and bruised, toppled cans and dented shelves. But she was unharmed. The animal control officers arrived shortly afterward, securing the area and checking the parking lot for signs the bear might linger. They reassured Jenna and spoke of the challenges bears faced living close to human settlements, where food sources like garbage bins, bird feeders, and in rare cases, grocery stores created dangerous temptations. News of the bear's grocery store visit spread quickly through Millersville. Locals shared stories about the audacity of a wild animal wandering boldly into a store, the chaos and surprise it caused, and Jenna's quick thinking that prevented a worse outcome. For Jenna, the event was a reminder of the delicate balance between human life and the wilderness that surrounded them. The bear, driven by hunger and perhaps the loss of its natural habitat, had crossed an invisible line, reminding everyone that wild creatures remained close in the quiet towns near the forest, drawn by the scent of human food. Officials urged the community to be vigilant, secure garbage, avoid leaving food outdoors, and respect the bear's space. The story became a cautionary tale about the consequences of encroaching on wildlife territory and the surprising ways nature could push back. In the following weeks, Jenna often thought about the bear, how it had moved through the store with calm determination, how close danger it felt, and how fragile the boundary between safety and threat could be. The memory was vivid. The bear's dark eyes met hers, the soft crunch of apples beneath giant paws, and the wildness beyond the glass doors. Though the damage was minor compared to what might have been, the incident left an imprint on the town's collective memory, a repeated story, a reminder that even in the most ordinary places, the wild could appear suddenly and change everything. Kenai Peninsula, Alaska, June 15, 2017. The emerald waters of the Kenai River had long been revered by anglers and outdoor enthusiasts as one of Alaska's most pristine waterways. Slicing through the Kenai Peninsula, the glacier-fed river was renowned for its salmon runs and breathtaking scenery. Dense forests of spruce and hemlock crowded the banks, concealing an abundance of wildlife, including one of North America's densest populations of brown bears, drawn to the river's bounty each summer. Fitzwilliam Fitz Montgomery and Percival Percy Rutherford had been kayaking partners for over 20 years. The two men, both 48, first met during their college days at a prestigious university and had maintained their friendship through annual wilderness adventures. While both had successful careers, Fitz as a corporate attorney in a major West Coast city and Percy as a neurosurgeon in the Pacific Northwest, they consistently set aside 2 weeks each summer to disconnect from their demanding lives and reconnect with nature and each other. Their journey down the Kenai had begun 3 days earlier at a popular launch site upriver. Their plan was to kayak the full length of the river, camping along the way and fishing for the legendary local king salmon. The first 2 days had been idyllic, with perfect weather, minimal mosquitoes, and several impressive catches they photographed and released. On the third day, around noon, they pulled their kayaks onto a small gravel bar for lunch. The spot was a picturesque clearing surrounded by thick willows and alders. According to Percy's later account, they had carefully followed recommended bear safety protocols throughout their trip, cooking away from their sleeping area, hanging food in bear-resistant containers, and carrying bear spray attached to their life vests. As they unpacked their sandwiches on the gravel bar, neither man noticed the subtle signs of bear activity. Fresh tracks partially washed away by the morning tide, broken branches on several nearby willows, and the remains of a partially eaten salmon hidden among the rocks. Unknown to them, a female brown bear with 2 cubs had claimed the area as a temporary resting place between fishing excursions. Percy later recalled hearing a low woofing sound moments before chaos erupted. The female brown bear burst from the willows less than 20 feet away, likely startled by their presence and immediately protective of her cubs. Her charge was lightning fast and ferocious. Fitz, who was closest to the bear's emergence point, was knocked violently into the rushing current before he could react. Percy fumbled for his bear spray, which was clipped to his life vest. In his panic, the canister slipped from his grasp and landed in the shallow water at the edge of the gravel bar. With the bear's focus momentarily diverted toward Fitz, Percy scrambled up a nearby cottonwood tree, climbing as high as the branches could support his weight. From a perch roughly 15 feet above the ground, Percy watched in horror as the scene unfolded below. Fitz had pulled himself back onto the gravel bar about 30 yards downstream, but he was disoriented and struggling to stay upright. The bear, fully committed to protecting her cubs from any perceived threat, charged again. Percy tried to shout a warning, but the roar of the river drowned out his voice. What followed, according to Percy's later report to authorities, was 3 minutes of pure terror that felt like 3 hours. The bear knocked Fitz down repeatedly as he attempted to get up, tearing his clothing and inflicting deep lacerations on his back and arms. He curled into a protective ball, shielding his head and neck as he had been taught in wilderness safety courses. The bear continued the attack, at one point dragging him several feet by his leg, breaking ribs and puncturing a lung. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the attack ended. The bear, perhaps convinced the threat had passed or drawn away by the sounds of her cubs nearby, retreated into the dense vegetation. Percy remained in the tree for nearly 20 minutes, watching for any sign of her return, before descending to help his critically injured friend. Using supplies from their first aid kit and strips of torn clothing, Percy managed to bandage Fitz's most serious wounds and fashioned a crude splint for his leg. With great effort, he dragged the semi-conscious Fitz into their larger two-person kayak. Believing that continuing downstream might lead them back into danger, Percy made the difficult decision to paddle upstream against the current toward the nearest ranger outpost they had passed earlier in the trip. After nearly 4 hours of exhausting effort, fighting both the current and the challenge of keeping Fitz stable, Percy spotted a small float plane skimming low over the river. The pilot, Wade Mackenzie, an experienced bush pilot, had been transporting supplies to a remote fishing lodge. He noticed the unusual sight of a backward-traveling kayak and the frantic waving of Percy's life vest. Mackenzie managed to land his plane on a straight stretch of the river and taxi toward the kayak. With his assistance, they transferred the now severely hypothermic and shock-stricken Fitz into the aircraft. The small plane, designed to carry only a few passengers with minimal gear, was just able to take off again with the extra weight thanks to Mackenzie's skill. Fitz underwent emergency surgery at a regional hospital, where doctors worked to repair his punctured lung and multiple deep wounds. After 6 hours of surgery and several blood transfusions, he was stabilized. His recovery would span several months and include multiple follow-up procedures, but against the odds, he survived. Wildlife authorities investigated the site the following day and confirmed Percy's account based on clear physical evidence. They concluded that the bear involved had been a female with cubs using the gravel bar as a temporary resting area between fishing attempts. No action was taken against the bear, as her behavior was deemed consistent with natural maternal instincts. Against all expectations, both men returned to the river exactly 1 year later. This time they traveled by guided jet boat rather than kayak, and visited the exact spot where the attack had occurred. There they placed a small, simple plaque among the rocks, not to commemorate their ordeal, but as a tribute to the wild power of the river and its inhabitants. The plaque read, "The river gives, the river takes. Respect both." The sun had only risen when Emily stepped onto the narrow, unmarked trail that twisted through the backcountry of a national park in the northwest corner of Wyoming. A quiet morning mist clung to the trees, and birds chirped in the upper branches. Emily, 29, a passionate solo hiker from Oregon, was no stranger to long, isolated treks. She had spent years hiking alone, documenting her journeys through photos and journal notes. This weekend, she had chosen a route she found on an old forum, quiet, remote, and barely touched. She started hiking light before dawn, her gear tucked into a small backpack. Noise-canceling headphones blocked out everything but the soft piano music she loved. The sound calmed her. She wasn't worried. She had bear spray and a whistle and knew the typical guidelines, but she preferred silence over the crunch of boots and wind in the trees. It made her feel free. The trail was overgrown, framed by thick lodgepole pines and dense underbrush. She had seen no one since leaving the trailhead. Around mile 5, the forest closed in tighter and she slowed. A shallow stream cut across the trail ahead, its banks muddy with fresh prints, though Emily didn't notice. Her music played softly, her breath steady as she stepped across a downed log. 100 feet away, hidden behind a curtain of young spruce, a large male grizzly was foraging for roots and early berries. The bear had not heard her. The breeze was faint and didn't carry her scent. Emily kept walking, focused on her path and lost in the music. When she stepped into the clearing and turned slightly toward the bear's side, the animal lifted its head sharply, its ears flattened. Its massive body went still. For a full second, neither of them moved. Then the bear charged. Emily didn't see it until it was almost on her. A rustle in the brush became a crashing sound, a blur of fur and muscle hurtling forward with terrifying speed. She ripped the headphones from her ears as the growl hit her like thunder. Her body froze. The bear was seconds away. Her instincts took over. She flung her backpack sideways and threw herself to the ground, arms over her neck, legs splayed. She lay still. Her heart raced so hard it hurt, but she didn't move. The grizzly slammed into her pack first, scattering gear and snapping a water bottle in half with its jaws. Then it turned to her. Its massive paws circled her back. Claws raked down her shoulder blades, slicing through her jacket and skin. She felt fire streak through her upper back as blood seeped into the earth. Then teeth found her thigh. The bear bit down hard, lifting her slightly, shaking her once. Her scream remained trapped in her throat. She fought to stay limp. The pain was all-consuming, like being crushed and sliced at once. Her breath stuttered, but she didn't scream. She didn't fight. It dropped her, huffed loudly, then raked her leg again with a paw. Another bite caught her ribs, tearing through flesh and pressing bone. Her vision blurred. Every part of her body begged to run, to roll away, but she didn't. She stayed limp, trying to convince the bear she was no longer a threat. The attack stretched into long, agonizing minutes. The bear circled, sniffed her body, and pawed at her backpack again. Her blood was everywhere. She heard nothing but the thundering beat of her heart, and the bear's snorting breath just inches from her. Then it stopped. She dared not lift her head, but could hear it walking away. Slow, heavy steps, cracking twigs. It paused once, grunted, and then the sound of movement faded into the trees. She lay still, even after silence returned. Only when she was sure the bear was gone did she lift her head, shaking, covered in blood. Her right leg was mangled. Deep punctures marked her upper arm and ribs. Her jacket was soaked through. She couldn't move without searing pain. One side of her chest felt caved in, a fracture, maybe several. She didn't have the strength to reach for her phone, and the nearest signal was miles away. Unused bear spray lay spilled near the stream, and her whistle was broken. She pressed her head into the dirt, fighting to stay conscious. The morning sun passed overhead. The heat crept in. Hours dragged by. Birds returned to the trees. A squirrel darted near her, then fled. At some point, her breathing slowed to shallow gasps. She drifted in and out, fading. It wasn't until early afternoon that a pair of backcountry rangers, rerouted after spotting her car alone at the trailhead, found her lying near the stream. One of them vomited at the sight of her wounds. The other radioed for air support. The helicopter landed 30 minutes later. Medics loaded her in, stabilizing her with IV fluids and oxygen. She was barely conscious but alive. Surgeons at a trauma center in Bozeman spent hours reconstructing her leg and cleaning the wounds. Her rib fractures were serious, but her lung hadn't collapsed. Her thigh required a metal rod. Her back would be scarred, but the damage to her spine had spared her mobility. The attack shocked everyone who heard about it. Photos of her torn backpack and shredded jacket circulated among park rangers and hikers. Officials used the incident to renew warnings across the national park and beyond. Do not hike silently. Do not wear headphones. Make noise, and let bears know you're coming. Emily survived, but everything changed. The trails that had once brought her peace now brought memories of teeth and claws, the moment of impact, and the unbearable silence before the roar. She no longer hiked alone. She kept the shredded jacket as a reminder, the scars beneath it now part of her story. She had come for solitude. Instead, she found a brutal reminder. Silence is not safety in bear country. It's a gamble. The vast expanse of sea ice stretching across Baffin Bay had been photographer Huxley Thornton Whitehall's obsession for nearly a decade. A veteran wildlife photographer with work featured in leading global publications and conservation journals, Thornton Whitehall had built his reputation on capturing intimate moments of Arctic wildlife, particularly the increasingly threatened polar bear. His efforts documenting the impacts of climate change on the Arctic ecosystem had earned multiple awards and helped bring international attention to the plight of these iconic predators. April in Nunavut typically offered ideal conditions for polar bear photography. The returning daylight allowed up to 14 hours of shooting time, while the sea ice remained solid enough to support both wildlife and human movement. The region was home to approximately 2,500 polar bears, roughly 15% of the global population, making it a premier destination for those seeking to document these apex predators in their natural habitat. On the morning of April 8th, Thornton Whitehall set out from the small Inuit community of Pond Inlet, where he had been based for the past 3 weeks. Accompanying him was local guide Aklak Kutuk, whose family had navigated and hunted across these frozen waters for generations. The two had developed a strong working relationship over several previous expeditions, with Kutuk providing transportation via snowmobile and offering critical insight into bear behavior and ice safety. According to Kutuk's later report to local authorities, they had traveled approximately 17 kilometers from the settlement when they spotted a large male polar bear hunting along the edge of an ice lid, a crack in the sea ice where seals often surface to breathe. Following standard safety protocols, they maintained what they believed was a safe distance of about 400 meters and set up Thornton Whitehall's camera equipment on a stable ice ridge. The photographer, known for his preference to work solo at times, insisted on continuing alone from that point. Kutuk agreed but remained nearby at the snowmobiles, keeping watch through binoculars. For nearly an hour, Thornton Whitehall photographed the bear as it paced along the ice edge without success. Then, seemingly uninterested in the lead, the bear began to move off in another direction. What happened next unfolded with startling speed. The bear, which had appeared focused on hunting, suddenly shifted course and began walking directly toward Thornton Whitehall's position. At first, the photographer did not appear concerned, continuing to take photos while gradually backing away. According to Kutuk, the bear's behavior changed markedly when it reached the area where Thornton Whitehall had been kneeling earlier, suggesting it had picked up his scent. The bear's walk turned into a trot and then, without warning, a full charge. Now clearly alarmed, Thornton Whitehall turned and began running toward the snowmobiles. Burdened by heavy Arctic clothing and his equipment, he struggled through the knee-deep snow that had drifted along the ridge. Kutuk immediately started the snowmobiles and raced toward him, but the difficult terrain and remaining distance made a rapid rescue impossible. Roughly halfway between his original position and the snowmobiles, Thornton Whitehall deployed a handheld marine flare, standard safety gear for Arctic fieldwork. The sudden burst of red light momentarily disoriented the bear, causing it to flinch and pause its advance. Seizing the opportunity, Thornton Whitehall attempted to reach a nearby pressure ridge in the ice that might offer partial cover. He didn't make it to the ridge. The bear, now within 20 feet, resumed its charge and overtook him with a powerful swipe that tore through his insulated outerwear and knocked him flat onto the ice. According to Thornton Whitehall's later account from his hospital bed, he remembered the immense weight of the animal standing over him, its breath steaming in the Arctic air, and the overpowering scent of seal fat clinging to its fur. Then, in a moment that later puzzled both the men and wildlife specialists, the bear simply stopped. It stood over the motionless photographer for several long seconds, appearing to study him with quiet curiosity. Then, without warning or aggression, it turned and walked away at a calm pace, occasionally glancing back but never returning. By the time Kutuk reached Thornton Whitehall's side, the animal was already several hundred meters away, moving toward another distant ice lead. Thornton Whitehall was conscious but seriously injured, bleeding from deep lacerations to his shoulder and back where the bear's claws had pierced through his clothing. Demonstrating remarkable composure, Kutuk administered emergency aid using supplies from their expedition kit and secured his injured companion to the snowmobile. The return journey to Pond Inlet was grueling, with every jolt on the rough ice causing Thornton Whitehall visible pain. From Pond Inlet, an emergency medical evacuation flight transported him to a regional medical facility where surgeons worked for hours to repair damaged muscles and tendons. After stabilization, he was transferred to a specialized trauma center in southern Canada for additional treatment and rehabilitation. Wildlife analysts reviewing the incident proposed that the bear had likely been exhibiting investigatory behavior rather than predatory intent. This theory was supported by evidence that the animal had access to natural prey, as suggested by the scent Thornton Whitehall recalled. The disorienting effect of the flare, combined with the photographer's instinctive stillness after the attack, closely resembling standard bear encounter protocol, may have led the bear to lose interest and withdraw. After 6 months of intensive rehabilitation, Thornton Whitehall regained about 80% function in his injured arm. The psychological recovery took longer, with recurring nightmares and a new sober respect for the strength and unpredictability of the wildlife he had spent his life documenting. In later interviews, he stressed that he did not blame the bear, acknowledging that he had willingly entered its territory and accepted the inherent risks. Most notably, 18 months after the attack, Thornton Whitehall returned to the Arctic with a renewed mission to document traditional knowledge about polar bear behavior and produce educational resources aimed at reducing human-wildlife conflicts in remote environments. His guide on that journey was once again Aklak Kutuk, the man whose swift actions had saved his life on the ice. The early morning fog clung thickly over the pine-lined outskirts of Clearwater, a small Montana town nestled at the edge of wilderness. The quiet streets held a fragile calm, but that morning, tension hung invisible in the air. 2 police officers, Daniels and Martinez, patrolled the area on routine duty, their sharp eyes scanning the edge where forest met suburb. Calls reported a massive grizzly bear roaming dangerously close to homes, knocking over trash bins and frightening residents. The officers had been trained for wildlife encounters, but nothing could fully prepare them for the moment that was about to unfold. Officer Daniels was 42, a seasoned lawman with years of experience in the rugged rural county. He carried himself with a steady confidence, familiar with the dangers lurking just beyond the tree line. Martinez, his partner, was younger, 35, with quick reflexes and a fierce determination to protect the community. Both men understood the risks of patrolling near bear country, especially in spring and early summer, when the animals wandered widely seeking food. They drove slowly down a gravel road, flanked by dense evergreens and scattered cabins. The smell of damp earth and pine filled the air, and birds called softly above. The officers knew the bear was close. Large paw prints and claw marks on trees marked the beast's recent path. As their patrol car rolled to a stop near the edge of a wooded area, both officers stepped out, their boots crunching on gravel. Their eyes scanned the shadows. Suddenly, without warning, a massive shape burst from the underbrush, a towering grizzly, its thick brown fur mottled and soaked with dew. The bear's eyes burned with wild fury, teeth bared, muscles rippling beneath its heavy frame. The charge came swiftly and brutally. Daniels barely had time to react. He reached for his taser and fired, the electric probe shooting toward the bear's chest. But the device seemed useless against the thick hide and raw power barreling toward him. The bear barely flinched. The grizzly slammed into Daniels with a deafening roar, knocking him backward. Pain exploded in his left arm as the bear's massive jaws clamped down, teeth sinking deep through fabric and flesh. Blood spurted, warm and sticky. Daniels screamed silently, his vision narrowing to red rings as the animal shook him violently. Martinez shouted a warning and drew his weapon, but it was not a gun. It was the bear spray, a last-ditch deterrent meant to repel but not kill. The bear swiped at Martinez, knocking him to the ground with a crushing blow. Rocks and dirt sprayed as the smaller officer tried to shield himself, his heart pounding. The bear's claws raked across his back, tearing through jacket and skin. Despite their injuries, the officers fought back with everything they had. Daniels, blood pouring from his arm, struggled to free himself from the bear's powerful grip. He grabbed Martinez's bear spray with desperate strength and fired a cloud of noxious spray directly into the bear's snarling face. The bear staggered back, coughing and pawing at its eyes. The sharp, burning spray pierced the animal's sensitive nose and eyes, breaking its relentless assault. Seizing the moment, Martinez scrambled to his feet, grabbing the second canister and unleashing a thick mist into the beast's open mouth and eyes. The grizzly roared in pain and fury, but began to retreat, limping awkwardly toward the shadowed woods. Blood dripped from its snout and clawed eyes, but it was alive and angry. The officers collapsed onto the gravel road, gasping for air and soaked in their blood. Daniel's left arm was mangled, with deep puncture wounds and crushed muscles. Martinez's back and ribs throbbed painfully, torn but intact. Within minutes, emergency medical teams arrived, alerted by frantic calls from nearby residents. Paramedics rushed to stabilize the men, applying pressure bandages to stop the bleeding and administering oxygen to ease their shallow breaths. A helicopter stood ready on a makeshift landing zone nearby, its rotors chopping through the tense morning air. The men were airlifted to the nearest hospital in Helena, Montana, where surgeons worked for hours to repair nerve damage, stop internal bleeding, and mend shattered bones. Both officers survived the attack but faced long, grueling recoveries. Daniels would need months of physical therapy to regain full use of his arm, while Martinez battled severe bruising and broken ribs that left him breathless for weeks. The attack sent shockwaves through the community and law enforcement agencies. Questions arose immediately about how such a dangerous encounter could occur so close to a town's edge, and whether police officers were adequately prepared for wildlife confrontations in areas where bears roamed freely. The taser's failure and the reliance on bear spray sparked fierce debate about police equipment standards and training. Wildlife experts and conservationists weighed in, reminding the public that grizzly bears were a protected species vital to the region's ecosystem, but could be deadly when threatened or cornered. They warned that expanding human settlements into bear habitats increased the risk of dangerous encounters, especially as bears followed food sources into populated areas. Authorities launched a review of bear management policies around Clearwater and similar towns. They looked at better community education on avoiding attractants like unsecured garbage and outdoor pet food. They also considered enhanced patrols, public alerts, and improved emergency response protocols. The incident was a brutal reminder of the wildness lurking beyond the human footprint for Daniels and Martinez. The attack left scars deeper than those visible on their bodies. Both men carried that day's weight in quiet reflection, knowing they had survived a fight few ever faced, and lived to tell the tale. Their courage and quick thinking saved each other's lives, and their ordeal became a stark warning to others about the fine line between man and nature in Montana's wilderness. The grizzly bear, powerful and untamed, remained a force of nature that no human weapon could fully control. Only respect and caution might keep such deadly meetings rare. The cargo vessel Arctic Voyager sliced slowly through the ice-choked waters of the Northwest Passage on a chilly, overcast afternoon in May 2025. Captain Sergei Ivanov, a seasoned mariner with decades of experience navigating these treacherous northern seas, kept a steady watch from the bridge. The world around him was changing fast. Melting sea ice opened new shipping routes that had been impassable only a few years ago. Yet the promise of quicker passages brought risks no one had fully anticipated. The ship's hold was packed tight with thousands of kilograms of salted and frozen fish, destined for remote Arctic communities. The strong smell of fish permeated the cold air, a faint but steady scent leaking through the seals of the refrigerated containers. The hold's doors were locked, but the bitter Arctic temperatures had started to thaw the seals and warp the metal edges, leaving small gaps. In the shifting ice and endless twilight, the Arctic Voyager was a beacon for more than just humans. After briefly docking at a tiny Arctic port along Nunavut's northern coast, the ship's crew performed routine checks. During the first watch, Nikolai and Alexei had been assigned to inspect the refrigerated cargo hold late at night. Nikolai was 28, a wiry deckhand from Murmansk with quick reflexes and a tough edge earned from years at sea. Alexei, 34, was a seasoned engineer, more cautious but steady under pressure. Descending the narrow metal stairwell, they stepped into the chilling cold of the hold, their breath visible in clouds. The floor beneath was slick with frost, and the faint glow from their flashlights cast eerie shadows across rows of stacked crates. The pungent odor of fish was stronger here, thick in the cold air. Nikolai's eyes flicked over the metal walls, sharp claws and scratch marks visible near the heavy hatch. A sudden low growl broke the silence. Both men froze. A massive white form erupted from the darkness like a ghost from the shadows. The polar bear stood nearly 10 feet tall on its hind legs, its thick white fur almost glowing in the faint light, and its dark eyes shining with wild hunger and desperation. It was a formidable force, a king of the Arctic's frozen wastes, but it was trapped in a place it did not belong. Nikolai shouted a warning, but his voice was swallowed by the bear's furious roar, which echoed through the hold like a thunderclap. The two men barely had time to react. Alexei grabbed a fire extinguisher, swinging it like a club, hoping to scare the beast away. The hollow clang of the extinguisher striking the bear's side seemed to irritate rather than deter it. With terrifying speed, the polar bear charged. Nikolai barely dodged a swipe of its massive paw, the heavy claws tearing the metal floor and kicking up shards of ice. The bear's momentum crashed into Alexei's left arm, shattering the fabric of his jacket and tearing deep into the flesh beneath. Blood seeped rapidly through torn skin, cold and sticky in the frozen air. His heart pounding, Nikolai grabbed a metal pipe from the nearby wall. He swung it with all his might, connecting with a harsh clang against the bear's snout. The animal snarled in pain but did not retreat. Instead, it pivoted and bit deep into Nikolai's right shoulder. Sharp teeth sank through muscle and bone, shredding flesh with horrifying force. Nikolai screamed silently, his vision blurring as the bear shook him violently. Summoning every ounce of strength, Nikolai jabbed the pipe into the bear's eye. The creature yelped, reeling back and pawing frantically at the injury. Alexei struggled to his feet, clutching his bleeding arm, and sprayed the fire extinguisher directly into the bear's face. The bear sneezed violently, stumbling backward, and its eyes watered. For a breathless moment, the threat seemed to pause. Then, with a sudden fury, it charged again, barreling toward the narrow stairwell that led back to the ship's upper decks. Nikolai and Alexei scrambled, bashing metal crates and railings, making as much noise as possible to intimidate the intruder. The bear halted at the base of the stairs, snarling and pounding the floor with massive paws, but did not follow. Gasping for breath, soaked in blood and pain, the two men collapsed against the cold steel walls. Nikolai's right shoulder was shattered, blood pouring from deep bite wounds. Alexei's left arm throbbed fiercely, bones bruised but intact. Their clothes were torn and stained. They knew the bear might return at any moment. Captain Ivanov was immediately informed. The ship's doctor came down with first aid supplies, applying pressure bandages and painkillers. Emergency communication was sent to the nearest Arctic medical facility, hundreds of miles away. As dawn broke over the ice, helicopters were dispatched. The Arctic Voyager's voyage was delayed indefinitely, while Nikolai and Alexei were evacuated for advanced treatment. Both men suffered serious but non-fatal injuries, deep puncture wounds, extensive bruising, and torn muscles. Surgeons would later confirm Nikolai had suffered partial nerve damage in his shoulder, threatening his ability to work at sea again. Later investigations revealed the polar bear had been drawn to the ship by the irresistible scent of fish. It had clawed its way through weakened seals and small gaps in the cargo hold, scavenging for hours before the crew's inspection. The damage was extensive. Crates were punctured, frozen fish spilled across the floor, and the scent had leaked into the port's quiet night air. Scientists studying the Arctic environment noted this was one of several recent incidents in which polar bears had come into direct contact with humans aboard ships and coastal settlements. Melting sea ice had forced the bears to alter their hunting patterns and seek food in new places, sometimes perilously close to human activity. The event triggered urgent discussions among maritime authorities and wildlife experts. It became clear that vessels operating in the Arctic needed better security measures, reinforced hold doors, electrified fencing systems, and trained wildlife deterrent teams to protect crews and wildlife alike. For Nikolai and Alexei, the ordeal left a permanent mark. The memory of that white fury, its wild eyes, powerful paws, and raw terror and pain would haunt them forever. Both men returned home with visible and invisible scars. They spoke little of the night, but carried its lessons in every cautious step afterward. The Arctic Voyager resumed its journey weeks later, sailing cautiously through shrinking ice fields. Yet the shadow of the bear's raid lingered, a stark reminder that the boundaries between human industry and wild nature were fragile and dangerous in this rapidly changing world. As the ship moved steadily north, the crew remained vigilant, knowing the Arctic was no longer a frozen wilderness, untouched by human presence. The polar bear's desperate raid was a warning. The frozen kingdom was shifting, and survival meant adapting to new rules where man and beast could no longer avoid crossing paths. The mountain reserve, located on the border between two southeastern states, had long held the title of the most visited protected wilderness area in the United States. Its ancient mist-veiled ridges housed an incredible range of plant and animal species, including one of the highest concentrations of black bears in North America. Millions of visitors traveled each year to explore its 800 square miles of forested landscape, seeking tranquility and adventure. While most encounters with the park's estimated 1,900 black bears concluded peacefully, not all did. The Harrington Fitzwilliams family, Montgomery, Eleanor, their children Reginald and Penelope, and their German shepherd, Archibald, had been preparing for their RV vacation to the area for months. Montgomery, a 42-year-old pharmaceutical executive from Chicago, had arranged for a 32-foot luxury motorhome, promoting it as an ideal way to enjoy the wilderness without abandoning comfort. Eleanor, a pediatric nurse, had initially suggested a more traditional camping experience but ultimately agreed to the compromise of an RV-based trip. According to the incident report later filed with local rangers, the family arrived at a campground along a river on August 15th. Nestled at a moderate elevation and known for its accessibility and scenic charm, the site was among the area's most frequented. Their first 2 days were uneventful, filled with drives through winding mountain roads, short hikes to nearby waterfalls, and evenings spent around their campfire roasting marshmallows. Upon check-in, they had received a standard safety briefing, including a pamphlet outlining how to manage food and waste to reduce the risk of attracting bears. That summer had seen an unusually dry season, resulting in sparse berry growth at higher elevations. As a result, bears were increasingly drawn to lower elevations and human-occupied zones in search of alternate food sources. On the evening of August 17th, the family prepared a hearty outdoor meal, grilling steaks and corn over the site's fire ring. According to Eleanor's later statement, they were diligent about cleanup, wiping down surfaces and storing leftover food in the RV's refrigerator. However, in their post-dinner relaxation, they overlooked two key items: a portable grill with a grease trap left outside, and a small cooler with drinks and condiments pushed partway under the RV's awning. By 9:30 p.m., the family had settled inside their motorhome. The children were watching a movie on a tablet while Montgomery and Eleanor played cards at the dinette. Archibald, the family's German shepherd, was the first to sense that something was wrong. His sudden, insistent barking startled the group. Montgomery rose and looked out into the darkness. What he saw froze him. A large black bear, later estimated to weigh around 350 pounds, was exploring their campsite, its bulk visible in the RV's exterior lights. The bear had already discovered the grease trap and was in the process of tearing it apart when Montgomery's face appeared at the window. The animal paused and locked eyes with him. In most situations, black bears retreat when they become aware of humans. This one did not. Instead, it advanced deliberately toward the motorhome. The bear began pawing at the RV's door, leaving deep scratches in the metal. The family retreated toward the rear of the vehicle, while Archibald barked furiously. Montgomery later recounted seeing the bear's breath fogging the glass as it rose on its hind legs and peered inside. Attempting to deter the bear, Montgomery cracked the door open to shout and wave his arms, a tactic he'd seen in a documentary. It was a mistake. The bear immediately lunged, nearly forcing its way inside before he managed to slam the door shut again. Its claws raked the doorframe, tearing off weather stripping and gouging the fiberglass exterior. Just as the bear resumed its assault, an unexpected distraction occurred. Archibald, who had been held back by Penelope, broke free and rushed the door, barking wildly. Though still inside, his display of aggression seemed to startle the bear, buying the family a few critical seconds. Coinciding with this pause, a parked vehicle on a routine patrol pulled into the campground. The flashing lights and engine noise finally drove the bear away. It vanished into the trees, leaving behind a damaged vehicle and a deeply shaken family. The responding officer, Ranger Juliana Martinez, documented the incident and initiated the setup of a bear trap in the area. In her report, she expressed concern about the animal's bold behavior, citing habituation and food conditioning, developments that, under park policy, could lead to relocation or euthanasia. Harrington Fitzwilliams declined relocation to another site and left the park early the next morning. During a follow-up conversation, Montgomery acknowledged that while they had received instructions on food storage, they had underestimated the risks of even minor oversights. 2 days later, the bear was captured at a nearby campsite after a similar incident. Wildlife biologists identified it as a mature male previously tagged for population research. Since the bear had not actually accessed human food and no injuries had occurred, officials opted to relocate it to a remote area within a nearby national forest, instead of euthanizing it. For the Harrington Fitzwilliams family, the encounter became a catalyst for change. Back in Chicago, Montgomery began donating annually to conservation efforts and developed an educational presentation on bear safety, which he regularly shared with local schools. Eleanor, reaffirming her original instincts, later persuaded the family to try camping again, this time in a tent but with a newfound respect for the rules of the wilderness and a commitment to doing things right. The Montana backcountry was a vast wilderness of towering pines, rocky ridges, and wide meadows bathed in late afternoon sunlight. Hunter Paul had been out for days tracking elk across this rugged land. He was a man in his early 40s, experienced and self-reliant, with a passion for the outdoors that had shaped his life since youth. That morning, his patience had paid off. A clean shot had brought down a large bull elk, and Paul had felt a deep satisfaction as he prepared to process the animal. As evening crept in, Paul set up camp in a small clearing near a creek, surrounded by thick forest. He hung some gear from a tree, but made a critical error. The elk carcass was left partially exposed on the ground near his tent. Fatigue and excitement dulled his caution. The crisp mountain air carried the rich scent of blood and meat, an irresistible lure to the local wildlife, especially the grizzlies known to roam these parts. Night fell quickly. The stars glittered overhead, and the forest grew silent except for the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. Paul lay inside his tent, exhausted and satisfied. Outside, hidden in the shadows beyond the firelight, a massive grizzly stirred, drawn by the smell of the fresh kill. The bear moved cautiously at first, sniffing the air with powerful nostrils, eyes reflecting moonlight. Hunger gnawed at it fiercely, and the scent of elk was a feast it could not ignore. The grizzly approached the camp silently, muscles rippling beneath thick fur, its heavy paws making little sound on the soft earth. Suddenly, Paul's dog, tethered nearby, began to bark sharply, breaking the quiet. The bear froze for a moment, then surged forward with terrifying speed. Paul rushed out of his tent, heart pounding, grabbing a flashlight and his hunting knife. He shouted and waved his arms, pounding the ground and yelling to scare the animal away. The grizzly reared back for an instant, then charged, its roar shattering the night like thunder. The first attack was brutal. The bear swiped with one massive paw, slamming Paul into the dirt with bone-crushing force. Pain exploded through his ribs, a sharp crack echoing inside his chest. The grizzly's jaws snapped near his arm, biting down with savage strength and tearing flesh. Blood poured freely as Paul struggled to fight back. Despite the fear and pain, Paul's instincts kicked in. He thrust his knife toward the bear's face, aiming for the sensitive eyes. The blade found its mark, eliciting a howl of rage from the beast. The grizzly shook violently, then lunged again. Paul used his boots as weapons, kicking fiercely at the bear's snout and sides. Each strike was desperate, meant to create space and slow the predator. He was no match for the grizzly's strength, but he knew that giving in meant certain death. The struggle raged on for minutes that felt like hours. The forest around them was silent, except for the clash of man and beast. Growls, snarls, grunts of pain, and the harsh sounds of Paul gasping for air. Finally, the bear, wounded and frustrated by Paul's resistance, pulled back, growling low, but retreating into the trees. Paul lay on the ground, bleeding heavily, ribs aching with every breath, limbs trembling. Pain threatened to overwhelm him, but survival drove him onward. He crawled back to his camp, reached his radio, and sent a faint distress signal. His voice was weak but urgent, and he hoped rescue teams would find him before darkness swallowed the forest completely. The night was long and cold. Paul used the last of his strength to tend to his wounds, wrapping torn clothes around deep cuts to slow bleeding. The sound of distant sirens and searching voices finally reached his ears just before dawn. Rescue crews arrived, carefully carrying Paul on a stretcher through the rugged terrain to a waiting helicopter. At the hospital, doctors worked quickly to repair shattered ribs, deep bite wounds, and punctures that had nearly reached vital organs. Though the injuries were severe, Paul was expected to survive. The attack left a permanent mark on him, not just physical scars, but a haunting memory of how quickly danger could erupt in the wilderness. It was a stark lesson in respect for the power of nature and the importance of caution. Wildlife officials used Paul's story to emphasize the dangers of improper carcass and food storage in bear country. They urged hunters and campers to follow strict protocols, secure meat in bear-proof containers, hang carcasses high and far from campsites, and always be aware of local wildlife activity. The incident was a harsh reminder that one small mistake could turn a rewarding hunt into a desperate fight for survival in the wild. The grizzly bear, a magnificent but deadly guardian of the Montana wilderness, had exacted a fierce revenge, teaching a lesson that would resonate for years. Shantar Islands, Russia, April 17, 2025. The remote Shantar Islands, a rugged archipelago in the Sea of Okhotsk off Russia's eastern coast, had long been known for their pristine wilderness and untamed beauty. Few humans ventured to this isolated outpost where brown bears roamed freely among dense taiga forests that met rocky shorelines. This raw, untouched quality attracted renowned director Mikhail Sorokin to choose the location for his ambitious wilderness survival film, Primal Edge. The production promised to showcase the island's dramatic landscapes, while telling a story of human resilience against nature's harshest elements. Leading actress Valentina Kovalevskaya, 34, had spent months preparing for her role as a stranded biologist fighting to survive in the wilderness. The Ukrainian-born performer had insisted on doing most of her stunts, believing it would lend authenticity to her portrayal. Production assistants noted that she had even undertaken wilderness survival training with experts and had expressed particular interest in learning about the region's wildlife, including its notorious brown bears. On that fateful spring morning, the weather conditions were ideal for filming. Clear skies with dramatic cloud formations on the horizon, and gentle waves lapping at the shore. The crew of 28 had established their temporary base camp half a kilometer from where filming was taking place, with proper waste management systems and bear-proof food storage mandated by Russian wilderness regulations. Security consultant Dmitry Vasilyev had conducted standard bear safety briefings before production began, but admitted later that certain protocols had been relaxed as filming progressed without incident for the first 2 weeks. Valentina had been preparing for a pivotal scene that required her to forage along the coastline. According to cinematographer Fyodor Borisov, she had stepped away from the main group to practice her movements while the crew adjusted lighting equipment. Several witnesses reported that sound technician Alexei Kuznetsov had been testing recording levels, generating considerable noise that echoed across the small bay. None noticed the massive brown bear that emerged from the tree line, approximately 70 meters behind Valentina's stand. Production assistant Irina Volkova was the first to spot the animal and call out a warning, but her voice was lost in the wind and the commotion of the busy set. When director Sorokin turned and saw the danger, the bear was already charging across the rocky beach toward the actress. Valentina, hearing the sudden shouts from the crew, turned just as the bear closed the final distance. The 400-kilogram animal struck her with tremendous force, knocking her onto the rocks and immediately beginning to maul her. Wildlife consultant Pavel Orlov later estimated that the bear was a male approximately 8 years old, possibly defending territory or attracted by unfamiliar scents and sounds. The crew's response was chaotic but determined. Security consultant Vasilyev fired warning shots from the team's bear deterrent flare gun, while several crew members rushed forward, banging metal equipment cases and shouting. Sound technician Kuznetsov drove one of the production vehicles directly toward the scene, honking continuously. Despite these efforts, the attack continued for nearly 40 seconds before the bear finally retreated, pausing several times to look back as it disappeared into the forest. The injuries Valentina sustained were severe but not fatal. She suffered deep lacerations to her back and shoulders, a broken collarbone, 3 fractured ribs, and significant blood loss. The production's medical officer, Dr. Natasha Ivanova, administered emergency first aid while the team contacted their emergency evacuation service. A Russian military helicopter arrived 90 minutes later, transporting Valentina to the regional hospital in Khabarovsk. Russian wildlife authorities located and euthanized the bear the following day, citing public safety concerns. Forensic examination confirmed it was indeed the animal responsible for the attack, as it had traces of Valentina's blood and clothing fibers in its claws. Production of Primal Edge was immediately suspended. Director Sorokin faced harsh criticism from environmental groups who questioned the wisdom of bringing a large film crew into such a sensitive habitat. The Russian Cinematography Commission launched an investigation into potential safety violations, particularly focusing on whether proper wildlife deterrents had been deployed around the perimeter of the filming area. Valentina underwent 6 hours of surgery and spent 3 weeks recovering in the hospital. In a statement released through her management, she expressed no ill will toward the bear, acknowledging that the animal behaved according to its nature. However, she called for stricter safety protocols for productions filming in wildlife habitats. The incident prompted the Russian Film Industry Association to develop new comprehensive guidelines for wilderness productions, particularly those involving apex predators. The attack also renewed debate about the ethics of filming in ecologically sensitive areas and the responsibilities of production companies to minimize their impact on wildlife. 6 months after the attack, Valentina had recovered sufficiently to complete filming for Primal Edge, though production was relocated to a controlled environment in British Columbia, Canada. The film was eventually released with a dedication to the wild places of the Shantar Islands and included an educational segment about bear conservation. Valentina Kovalevskaya's performance earned critical acclaim, with many reviewers noting her genuine vulnerability to the role, an unintended consequence of her harrowing real-life encounter with one of nature's most formidable predators. Igor had been a drone pilot for more than a decade, specializing in wildlife surveys and filming rare animals in remote regions. His passion for technology and nature merged in this challenging work, flying advanced drones over vast wilderness areas to capture elusive creatures on camera. On May 18, 2025, deep in the dense forests of Russia's Ussuri Krai, Igor and his assistant Pavel were engaged in their most ambitious project yet, documenting the behavior of the region's grizzly bears, known for their size and aggression. Igor, in his early 40s, was lean and weathered from years spent outdoors. Pavel, a few years younger, was a sharp and cautious observer, responsible for ground support and safety. The two men shared a quiet respect for the wild, fully aware of the risks involved, but committed to collecting valuable data. Their equipment was state-of-the-art. The drone alone had cost Igor a staggering $50,000, an investment justified by the potential scientific value. Over the years, they had tracked elusive wolves, rare leopards, and migratory birds across unforgiving terrain. But this assignment carried unique danger. Grizzlies were unpredictable and territorial, and the dense vegetation offered little visibility or protection. Still, the potential rewards, a detailed study of an apex predator's behavior in its natural habitat, were too great to pass up. That morning, the sky was overcast with heavy clouds, and the air smelled fresh and cold, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. They had set up near a wide riverbank where a large male grizzly had been spotted feeding. The massive bear stood nearly 10 feet tall when upright, its broad shoulders and powerful muscles unmistakable even from a distance. Igor adjusted the drone's controls, fine-tuning the camera to zoom in without disturbing the animal. Pavel stationed himself about 20 meters away, keeping watch over both the bear and Igor. They had agreed on a strict safety protocol. Never approach the bear on foot, keep the drone at a safe altitude, and remain ready to retreat at the first sign of aggression. For hours, the bear remained preoccupied, tearing into salmon carcasses along the shore and occasionally sniffing the air. Igor slowly launched the drone. It buzzed quietly as it rose and moved steadily toward the bear. From Pavel's position, he watched the drone maneuver with practiced precision, maintaining a safe but close distance. Igor controlled it with ease, his focus fixed on the screen as the drone captured the bear's every move. Without warning, the bear's ears twitched, and it locked eyes with the hovering machine. For a moment, it remained still, muscles taut beneath thick fur. Then, with a sudden roar, it charged toward the airborne intruder. The drone jolted midair as the signal flickered. Igor struggled to regain control. As the bear bolted toward the tree line, Pavel realized it was headed straight for Igor. The drone dipped in altitude while Igor worked frantically to pull it back. Realizing the danger, Igor turned to run, his boots sinking into the muddy ground. His breath came in gasps, adrenaline surging, but the bear closed the distance quickly, crashing through the underbrush with devastating speed and power. Pavel tried to call out, but the moment had already turned deadly. The bear struck with terrifying force. Igor was knocked to the ground, his clothing and body torn by the animal's powerful claws. His attempts to defend himself were no match for the sheer strength of the predator. Pavel, frozen in place for a few seconds, could only watch in horror as the violent encounter unfolded just meters away. The sounds of the attack echoed through the forest, raw, primal, and merciless. The bear continued its assault until Igor's movement slowed, then ceased altogether beneath the predator's crushing weight. It was a grim and brutal end, a stark reminder of the wild's unforgiving nature. Nearby, the drone hovered briefly before the bear turned its rage on it. With 2 swift swipes, the animal destroyed the machine, sending shards of metal and plastic scattering across the forest floor. The advanced technology, a marvel of modern engineering, now lay broken and useless among the twigs and moss. Pavel's mind raced. Terrified for Igor and overwhelmed by the chaos, he knew he had to act. He ran through the forest, pushing toward the nearest ranger station several kilometers away. Driven by panic, he pushed through exhaustion, branches scraping his face and legs burning with each step. Eventually, he reached the station and alerted search teams. A group of rangers armed with rifles, radios, and medical kits followed him back into the forest. The trail felt quiet and heavy on their return. Only rustling leaves and the distant sound of the river broke the silence. They found Igor's body in a clearing, torn and lifeless. The severity of the injuries left no doubt that survival had been impossible. Nearby, the shattered drone lay in fragments, a grim reminder of what had occurred. The incident shocked the scientific and drone communities. Experts raised urgent concerns about the risks of operating unmanned aircraft near apex predators. Calls for stricter regulations and improved safety protocols quickly followed. The wilderness, once again, had delivered a harsh lesson on the dangers it held. In the days that followed, Pavel grappled with grief and survivor's guilt. He had witnessed the unthinkable and led rescuers back to the scene, but the loss of his colleague left a deep and lasting scar. The forest, once filled with wonder and possibility, now felt cold and merciless. Despite the pain, Pavel made a vow to honor Igor's legacy by improving safety standards and educating others about the real risks of wild encounters. Igor's passion for merging technology with nature had been inspiring, but the cost had been immense. The pursuit of knowledge, Pavel now understood, often came with staggering consequences. News of the tragedy spread far beyond the region, serving as a somber warning to drone operators, explorers, and wildlife enthusiasts worldwide. No device, regardless of its sophistication, could replace the respect and caution demanded by nature's most dangerous creatures. The bear's attack became an enduring symbol of the wild's raw power, one that Pavel and many others would never forget. A national park in northwestern Montana, August 14, 2023. The national park had long been revered for its breathtaking landscapes. Jagged mountain peaks, pristine lakes, and vast wilderness areas stretching over 1 million acres along the Montana-Canada border. The park was home to one of the densest grizzly bear populations in the continental United States, with an estimated 300 bears roaming freely throughout the protected lands. Despite numerous warning signs and mandatory visitor orientations about bear safety, close encounters occurred with alarming regularity, particularly during late summer when bears intensified their feeding before winter hibernation. Thad Wellington Pierce, a 38-year-old software developer from Portland, had been planning his solo mountain biking adventure through the national park's backcountry for months. An experienced outdoorsman with multiple wilderness expeditions under his belt, Thad had extensively researched the park's trails and chosen a remote route that park rangers designated as advanced due to its technical difficulty and isolation. He had obtained all the necessary permits and attended the mandatory bear safety briefing, where rangers had specifically cautioned against high-speed riding through blind curves and thick vegetation. On that fateful August evening, the conditions seemed perfect for what Thad later described as the ride of a lifetime. Golden hour sunlight filtered through the pines, casting long shadows across the narrow dirt trail as he navigated a particularly challenging single-track section. He had been riding for nearly 6 hours and was finally pushing to reach his designated camping area before dusk. Park records would later show that a female grizzly and her 2 cubs had been spotted in the same vicinity just 3 days earlier. According to Thad's subsequent account to park authorities, he had come around a sharp bend at approximately 20 miles per hour when he heard a distinctive huffing sound coming from a thicket of huckleberry bushes just off the trail. Before he could process what was happening, a massive grizzly sow erupted from the vegetation less than 30 yards ahead, her 2 half-grown cubs scrambling in opposite directions. The bear immediately identified Thad as a threat to her young and charged, covering ground with astonishing speed. Wildlife biologist Dr. Helena Martinez would later explain that Thad had inadvertently created a perfect storm scenario. His silent but rapid approach had likely startled the bears at close range, and his position between the mother and one of her cubs triggered her protective instincts. The sow, estimated to weigh around 350 pounds, accelerated to nearly 35 miles per hour within seconds. Thad attempted to brake and simultaneously reach for the bear spray canister on his belt, but in his panic, struck a protruding tree root that sent his front wheels sideways. The impact launched him over the handlebars onto the rocky trail, his helmet cracking against a boulder. Dazed but conscious, he crawled behind a fallen lodgepole pine as the bear's heavy footfalls closed in. Following protocol from his safety training, Thad curled into a protective position, covering his neck with his hands and remaining as still as possible. The grizzly approached the log and circled briefly, before delivering a powerful blow that splintered the wood and struck Thad's left side. 3 ribs cracked under the impact. Park wildlife experts later determined the bear was likely attempting to assess whether Thad posed an ongoing threat rather than actively trying to kill him. After what Thad described as the longest 60 seconds of my life, during which he could feel the bear's hot breath and hear its labored snorting just inches away, the sow abruptly retreated. She collected her cubs and disappeared into the forest, occasionally stopping to look back toward the injured cyclist. Once certain the bears had gone, Thad activated his emergency GPS beacon. Despite severe pain from his broken ribs and a deep gash on his forearm, he managed to drag himself to a small clearing where rescue personnel could spot him more easily. Park rangers arrived via helicopter 90 minutes later as dusk settled over the mountains. Flight paramedic Jessica Rainwater stabilized Thad's injuries before the airlift to Kalispell Regional Medical Center, where he underwent surgery for internal bleeding caused by bone fragments. During his recovery, Thad worked with park wildlife officials to document the encounter in detail, providing valuable data on bear behavior and human-wildlife interactions. The incident prompted the national park to implement enhanced safety measures, including expanded mandatory bear safety education for all backcountry permit holders and new signage targeting mountain bikers. Senior Park Ranger Marcus Blackwood instituted a pilot program requiring bells or noise-making devices for all cyclists on certain high-risk trails during peak bear activity seasons. Wildlife management officials chose not to track or relocate the bear and her cubs, as their behavior was deemed a natural defensive response rather than predatory aggression. The trail section where the attack occurred was temporarily closed for 2 weeks before being reopened with additional warning signs. 6 months after the attack, Thad Wellington Pierce had recovered sufficiently to return to mountain biking. However, he admitted to friends that he now exclusively rode in groups and carried 2 canisters of bear spray whenever in grizzly country. He advocated for wildlife conservation and bear awareness, occasionally giving talks at outdoor recreation shops about his experience. The mangled remains of his carbon fiber mountain bike were donated to the National Park Visitor Center, where they became part of an educational display about safely sharing wilderness with its original inhabitants. In his written statement for the park's annual safety report, Thad noted that despite the trauma of his encounter, he considered himself fortunate. The bear, he acknowledged, had shown remarkable restraint. The same could not be said for his approach to biking in bear country, a lesson he hoped others would learn without hearing a grizzly's thundering footfalls gaining ground behind them. Alex had long been drawn to the remote wilderness of the northern mountain ranges, a passionate angler and outdoorsman who sought solitude and the thrill of isolated fishing trips. In his early 30s, lean and experienced, he was no stranger to the risks of the wild, always approaching it with careful respect, honed over years of outdoor living. On May 30th, 2025, he camped beside a wide, slow-moving river deep in the rugged backcountry, an area well known for frequent grizzly bear activity. The air carried a crisp morning chill, and the forest around him whispered with the sounds of awakening wildlife. The previous evening had been peaceful. He spent hours casting along the river's edge, the steady flow of water and distant birdsong easing his mind. At dawn, he packed his gear and prepared to explore farther upstream, unaware that danger lay much closer than expected. The region was a known denning and feeding ground for grizzlies, including a female with cubs recently reported by wildlife officials. But Alex's thoughts were on the water, focused more on fishing opportunities than the unseen hazards nearby. As sunlight filtered through the dense canopy, he moved quietly through the underbrush. The damp earth beneath his boots felt soft and uneven, scattered with pine needles and decaying leaves. His backpack carried fishing rods, tackle, and basic camping supplies, while his hands gripped a small cooler with bait. The steady murmur of the river grew louder with each step. Hidden just off the trail, a large female grizzly rested in a shallow den, camouflaged by fallen branches and thick undergrowth. 2 cubs, nearly a year old but already sizable, lay beside her, their small bodies rising and falling with each breath. Though appearing at ease, the sow remained alert, her senses finely tuned to any potential threat. Her maternal instincts were fierce, an ingrained readiness to defend her young with overwhelming force. Alex continued his careful approach to the riverbank, setting his sights on a promising new fishing spot. He failed to notice the subtle signs, broken twigs, disturbed earth, that hinted at the bear's presence. The stillness of the morning masked the tension in the forest. Then, with no visible trigger, the grizzly charged. The roar that followed shattered the calm, a raw, primal cry of defense and aggression. Alex froze for a split second, adrenaline surging through him. The suddenness of the encounter left no room to escape. He dropped his gear instinctively, the cooler and rods crashing to the ground as he tried to back away. With terrifying speed, the bear closed the gap. He raised his hands in an effort to appear non-threatening, but it was too late. The sow reached him in moments, her powerful jaws locking onto his right leg. Pain exploded instantly, sharp, blinding, and deep, as teeth tore into flesh and bone. The force of the impact hurled him to the ground, his body colliding with rocks and dirt. Driven by instinct, Alex grasped a thick branch from the ground and struck at the bear with everything he had. He pounded at its head and shoulders, fueled by fear and desperation. His shouts rang out through the trees, echoing against the trunks with raw intensity. Startled by the resistance, the bear hesitated, For a brief moment, its growls softened, and its eyes darted between Alex and the makeshift weapon in his hand. After a pause that seemed to stretch forever, the bear turned slowly and backed into the forest, disappearing with her cubs into the thick brush. Alex lay gasping, blood pooling around him, his body racked with pain and exhaustion. His leg was severely injured, torn, fractured, and bruised, but he was conscious, and he was alive. Summoning every ounce of remaining strength, he began crawling back to camp. Each movement was excruciating, but the will to survive pushed him forward. Eventually, he reached his campsite, dragging himself to his emergency signal device and activating it. Every noise in the forest kept him alert as he waited, unsure if the bear would return. Within an hour, a rescue helicopter arrived, and he was transported to a trauma facility. Doctors performed multiple surgeries to repair the extensive injuries to his leg. Over the following weeks, he endured pain, infections, and slow physical therapy sessions. The journey to recovery was grueling, but his determination remained unshaken. The incident served as a stark reminder of how unpredictable bear encounters could be, especially when cubs were involved. Wildlife experts emphasized the danger of surprising a mother bear, noting that even seasoned outdoorsmen could become victims of territorial aggression. Alex's ordeal became a cautionary tale, a vivid example of why vigilance and preparedness are essential in bear country. In the months that followed, Alex spent time reflecting on the incident with a deeper understanding. Years of wilderness experience had taught him many lessons, but this one came with a steep cost. He came to accept how narrow the margin for error could be in the wild. Respect, awareness, and humility were no longer just principles, they were survival tools. His physical scars would last, but Alex's spirit remained intact. The Grizzly's charge was both a terrifying ordeal and a transformative moment. It strengthened his resolve to educate others about the realities of venturing into predator-rich habitats. He began speaking about his story, urging fellow adventurers to learn from his experience and never underestimate the raw power of nature. Back in the forest, the rhythms of wildlife resumed. The mother bear and her cubs moved on, their presence marked by the lasting imprint they had left on one human life. For Alex, the path forward was shaped by pain, resilience, and a renewed commitment to coexist with the wild, not as its conqueror, but as a respectful visitor who had faced its fury and survived. Kodiak Island, Alaska, USA, July 5, 2019. Kodiak Island, the second largest island in the United States, stood as a rugged testament to Alaska's wild splendor. Separated from the mainland by the treacherous Shelikof Strait, the island's 3,670 square miles hosted the largest subspecies of brown bear in the world, the massive Kodiak bear. These magnificent creatures, which could weigh up to 1,500 pounds and stand 10 feet tall on their hind legs, had evolved in isolation for approximately 12,000 years, developing distinctive characteristics from their mainland cousins. Local Alutiiq people had coexisted with these apex predators for millennia, developing deep cultural connections and respect for the bears they called Takuka'ak. Brothers Zachariah and Ezekiel Thornbrush had been commercial fishermen in Alaska for over 15 years, operating their 32-foot trawler, the Northern Light, primarily in the rich waters surrounding Kodiak Island. The siblings, originally from Tacoma, Washington, had fallen in love with Alaska's raw beauty and challenging environment during a post-college adventure and never returned to the lower 48 states. They had established themselves as respected members of the tight-knit fishing community and were well-versed in working in bear country. On that clear summer afternoon, the Thornbrush brothers found themselves in the thick of the salmon run, reaping the rewards of the season's bounty as they filled their hold with nearly 800 pounds of gleaming Pacific salmon. They had anchored their 16-foot aluminum skiff approximately 75 yards offshore in a small sheltered cove on the island's eastern side to process their catch before returning to the harbor. The location was a favorite spot of theirs, offering protection from prevailing winds and spectacular views of the island's forested mountains. As experienced fishermen, they knew proper fish cleaning protocol in bear territory meant disposing of waste in deep water, well away from shore. However, a recent shoulder injury had slowed Zachariah's work pace considerably. The process took longer than usual, and a 5-gallon bucket half filled with fish remnants sat near the stern as they methodically worked through the catch. Alaskan authorities for fish and game officials would later note that this temporary storage of processing waste likely contributed significantly to what happened next. Wildlife biologist Dr. Nathan Silverstein, who specialized in Kodiak bear behavior, explained that the day's atmospheric conditions had created a perfect scenario for the bear's extraordinary sense of smell. A light breeze blowing directly from the boat toward shore, carrying the unmistakable scent of fresh fish across the water. Bears can detect food odors from over a mile away, and this particular animal would have been hyperphagia, intensely focused on consuming calories before winter. According to the brothers' account, they first noticed the enormous male bear standing motionless on the rocky beach approximately 100 yards away, its nose lifted high, testing the air currents. Ezekiel estimated the bear weighed at least 1,200 pounds, a mature male in his prime. The animal showed no hesitation as it waded into the cold water and began swimming directly toward their skiff with powerful, determined strokes. The brothers immediately recognized the danger and abandoned their processing work. Zachariah attempted to start the outboard motor while Ezekiel shouted and waved his arms to deter the approaching bear. The engine, which had been running flawlessly all day, chose that critical moment to sputter and stall. Later investigation revealed that fish scales had clogged the water intake, causing the motor to overheat and temporarily fail. By the time Ezekiel grabbed a boat hook from beneath the gunwale, the massive bear had reached the skiff and attempted to climb aboard, its enormous claws puncturing the aluminum hull as easily as paper. The vessel's starboard side dipped dangerously under the animal's immense weight, allowing seawater to splash over the gunwale. The brothers later described the bear's eyes as focused solely on the bucket of fish remnants, seemingly oblivious to their presence just feet away. Standing precariously in the tilting boat, Ezekiel repeatedly drove the metal hook into the bear's shoulder and muzzle. The bear released a deep, rumbling growl that Zachariah later described as feeling like it vibrated my entire skeleton, but refused to relinquish its position. After several strikes to its sensitive nose, the animal finally released its grip and slid back into the water. Rather than retreating, however, it circled the skiff twice before finally swimming toward a different section of shoreline. With shaking hands, Zachariah cleared the engine intake and restarted the motor. The brothers immediately headed to Kodiak Harbor, where they reported the incident to wildlife authorities. Alaskan authorities, including fish and game officials, interviewed the Thornbrush brothers extensively and launched a monitoring operation for the unusually bold bear. Trail cameras were installed along that section of coastline, and warning notices were posted for other fishermen. The skiff required significant repairs, with puncture holes and deep claw marks along the starboard side. Local marine mechanic Ingrid Wolanski, who documented the damage, commented that in her 22 years of repairing boats on Kodiak, she had never seen such dramatic evidence of a bear encounter on water. The incident prompted the Alaska Fish and Game authorities to revise their safety literature for commercial and recreational fishermen, emphasizing that bears increasingly associate boats with easy food sources. Marine Patrol Officer Marcus Kingsley initiated a community education program specifically addressing the proper handling of fish waste in bear habitat, stressing that distance from shore alone does not guarantee safety from these powerful and determined swimmers. The Thornbrush brothers continued fishing operations, but invested in a new safety system with marine bear deterrence and a redundant engine setup. They also became reluctant local celebrities, occasionally sharing their experience during the harbor's annual bear awareness workshops. Ezekiel often concluded these talks by displaying the bent boat hook, a sobering reminder that on Kodiak Island, the line between predator and prey was usually just 75 yards of cold Alaskan water. Leah and Jason had spent years dreaming of escaping the relentless pace of city life for the quiet refuge of Oregon's vast, untamed forests. Both in their late 20s, they were skilled campers who prided themselves on their knowledge of wilderness safety and their deep respect for nature. On a clear, cool summer evening in early July 2025, they found themselves deep in the Cascade Mountain Range, far from any roads or trails, surrounded by towering fir trees and dense brush that blanketed the forest floor. The couple had carefully selected a small clearing to set up camp. They pitched their tent beneath the canopy of ancient evergreens, adhering strictly to established safety practices, particularly those concerning food storage. Their backpacks, heavy with supplies, were suspended from a sturdy branch well away from the sleeping area to reduce the risk of attracting wildlife. They had read numerous warnings about black bears in the area and were well aware of how easily one misstep could turn into a life-threatening situation. After a long day spent hiking along narrow, mossy paths beside rushing streams, Leah and Jason built a campfire to warm themselves and prepare dinner. The forest was already deep in shadow, with darkness settling over the trees. Birdsong faded into the rhythmic crackling of firewood, accompanied only by the occasional rustling of leaves stirred by the evening wind. Leah handled the meal preparation, carefully frying meat and vegetables in a small, greasy pan over a portable stove placed near the fire pit. The savory aroma mingled with the smoky scent of the fire, saturating the cool air around the campsite. Jason sat on a nearby log, peeling an orange and quietly observing the interplay of flame and shadow in the surrounding woods, content in the tranquil stillness. Then a subtle movement caught Leah's attention. Beyond the reach of the firelight, a shadow shifted quietly in the brush. Her breath hitched as she recognized the unmistakable silhouette of a black bear stepping from the undergrowth, its dark fur blending almost perfectly with the twilight. The animal moved slowly but with intent, clearly drawn by the smell of cooking food. Leah remained motionless, still holding the pan. Jason, too, had noticed the bear and watched intently as it crept forward, sniffing the air. The bear's eyes glinted faintly in the firelight, curious but wary. Both campers understood that the animal knew they were there, but hadn't yet decided whether to continue its approach or flee. Every second stretched out as the bear inched closer, its nose twitching at the scent of hot oil and meat. Leah held her breath, signaling to Jason to stay perfectly still. They both knew that sudden movement or loud noise might provoke an attack, and now, frozen in place, they silently hoped the bear would turn back. But then, a mishap shattered the stillness. Leah's grip faltered and the greasy pan slipped from her hands, clattering loudly onto the ground and spilling hot oil near the fire pit. The sudden sizzle was sharp and startling. Flames flared upward, catching the oil and sending a burst of sparks into the dry leaves around them. The bear reacted immediately. Instead of fleeing, it lunged toward the spilled food in a frenzy, toppling the fire pit in its rush. Flames burst outward and embers flew as the fire spread, fueled by oil and kindling. In an instant, chaos erupted. Jason sprang to his feet, adrenaline flooding his system. His thoughts raced. There was now danger from both the fire and the now agitated bear. The animal's form grew larger and more aggressive as it advanced. Its heavy muscles rippled under thick fur, and then it struck. Leah was caught by the bear's powerful swipe. Claws tore through her pants and sliced into her leg, leaving deep, ragged wounds. The force of the blow sent her stumbling backward, shock and pain rendering her momentarily unable to react. Jason, acting on instinct, grabbed a metal cooking pot and began smashing it against a nearby rock. He raised his voice in a series of sharp, commanding bursts, striking the pot repeatedly to create a harsh, disorienting noise meant to drive the bear away. Every moment hung in suspense as the bear paused, uncertain. The animal glanced between the flaring fire and Jason's loud disruption. Then suddenly it turned and bolted back into the forest, vanishing into the darkness and leaving behind a trail of broken brush and scattered debris. Jason rushed to Leah's side, his pulse hammering in his ears. Blood seeped from the deep gashes on her leg, staining the forest floor. Tearing fabric from his shirt, he quickly fashioned a crude bandage and wrapped it tightly around her thigh to control the bleeding. Leah gritted her teeth and braced herself against the pain, her body trembling with each shallow breath. Though injured and shaken, Leah stayed alert while Jason helped her prepare for the hike out. They knew they needed medical attention fast. Carefully, they extinguished the fire remnants, pouring water over the smoldering coals to prevent further spread. Their journey back through the forest was slow and tense. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the trees set their nerves on edge. The wilderness, once a place of peace and serenity, now felt ominous, but they pressed on, driven by the will to survive. Eventually, they reached a ranger station several miles away. Emergency responders were already mobilizing. Leah was quickly transported by air to the nearest hospital, where doctors worked to stabilize and treat her injuries. Her wounds were serious and required multiple surgeries, but thanks to her resilience and Jason's rapid response, permanent damage was avoided. The incident soon became a widely shared story within the outdoor community, underscoring the delicate balance between humans and wildlife in Oregon's wilderness. Officials pointed to the event as a reminder of how quickly things could spiral out of control, from a dropped pan to a life-threatening encounter. They emphasized the importance of rigorous food safety protocols, proper fire handling, and calm decision-making during wildlife interactions. Leah and Jason's experience became a cautionary tale, recounted by hikers, campers, and nature lovers, as a testament to both the dangers of the backcountry and the importance of preparation. Though Leah carried physical scars from that night, she and Jason emerged with a deeper bond forged through survival. The forest remained a place of profound beauty, but now it also held a darker memory of a night when danger came too close, and only calm minds and quick action made the difference between life and tragedy. Absaroka Range, Wyoming, USA, September 18th, 2021. The Absaroka Range, a rugged sub-range of the Rocky Mountains stretching across the Wyoming-Montana border, had long been considered one of America's last great wilderness frontiers. Named after the Native American Absaroka tribe, these remote mountains were characterized by jagged peaks, deep valleys, and dense forests, providing ideal habitat for a recovering grizzly bear population. Unlike the more famous Teton Range to the west, the Absarokas remained relatively untouched by tourism, attracting only the most dedicated wilderness enthusiasts seeking solitude and raw natural beauty. Experienced mountaineers Quentin Rasmussen and Lorelei Hemingford Chase had been climbing partners for nearly 7 years, tackling increasingly challenging routes across North America. Their shared passion for alpine climbing had taken them to some of the continent's most remote peaks, but the Absaroka Range held special significance for them both. 3 years earlier, they had first discussed their plan to climb all of Wyoming's major ranges, documenting the biodiversity and geological features they encountered along the way. Their current expedition targeted a lesser-known ridge in the eastern section of the range, a technical route that required both rock climbing skills and wilderness navigation. The September timing had been deliberately chosen to avoid summer thunderstorms while providing enough daylight for their planned traverse. They hadn't fully accounted for that early autumn represented peak foraging season for the area's grizzly bears, when the animals consumed up to 20,000 calories daily in preparation for winter hibernation. According to the detailed journal Lorelei maintained throughout their expeditions, the pair had begun their descent from the ridge summit shortly after 2 p.m., having spent approximately 40 minutes documenting the rare alpine plants they'd found at higher elevations. The weather had been ideal, clear skies with moderate temperatures and light winds. They had been moving carefully down a narrow couloir, using down-climbing techniques and short rappels where necessary. Quentin, leading the descent, had just navigated around a prominent boulder when he froze in place, his right hand raised in their established signal for immediate caution. Approximately 30 yards below, a massive grizzly bear was laboriously climbing the same route they needed to descend. Based on their photographs, wildlife biologist Dr. Eleanor Kittredge would later estimate that the bear was a mature male, weighing approximately 600 pounds. The climbers immediately retreated to a small rock ledge, approximately 4 feet wide and 8 feet long, positioned about 20 feet above the couloir floor. This defensive position offered them protection from above and to one side, but left them exposed if the bear chose to investigate. Following proper bear encounter protocol, they made themselves visible while trying to appear non-threatening, speaking in calm tones to alert the animal to their presence without startling it. The grizzly continued its ascent following a game trail that zigzagged the rocky slope. When it reached a point directly below their position, the bear stopped and raised its head, nostrils flaring as it detected their scent. Rather than showing aggression or fear, the animal demonstrated what park rangers would later describe as intense curiosity. It stood on its hind legs, reaching an impressive height of nearly 8 feet, and surveyed the ledge where they huddled against the rock face. For the next 17 minutes, a duration Lorelei recorded precisely in her journal, the bear circled beneath their position, occasionally rising on its hind legs to better observe them. It showed no signs of aggression, but no intention of leaving the area. The climbers maintained their disciplined calm, though Quentin later admitted that his heart was pounding so loudly he feared it might provoke the bear further. Reviewing the incident afterward, park wildlife technician Jasper Whitlock noted that the bear's behavior suggested it had likely encountered humans before and didn't perceive them as either prey or an immediate threat. This assessment comforted the climbers, who knew grizzly behavior could change instantly. After an eternity, the stranded climbers and the bear finally appeared to lose interest. It dropped to all fours and ambled down a different slope section, occasionally glancing back toward their position. Even after the animal disappeared from view, Quentin and Lorelei waited an additional 30 minutes before attempting to continue their descent, using different calls and deliberate noises to announce their movements. The remainder of their journey to the trailhead was completed in tense silence, both climbers hyper-aware of their surroundings. They reached their vehicle shortly before dusk. They immediately reported the encounter to the national park officials, who documented their experience and passed the information to Wyoming authorities for game and fish. Wildlife Management Officer Serena Blackwood conducted a detailed interview with the climbers the following day, collecting GPS coordinates and photographs to add to the department's growing database of bear encounters in the region. She explained that the Absaroka Range had seen increasing bear activity as the greater Yellowstone ecosystem grizzly population continued its recovery from near extinction in the lower 48 states. The incident highlighted that bears in the region frequently use the same high mountain travel corridors as humans, creating inevitable overlap between climbing routes and wildlife pathways. In response, the Wyoming Climbers Coalition partnered with state wildlife officials to develop new guidelines specifically addressing bear encounters at elevation, something previous safety literature had largely overlooked in favor of focusing on campsite encounters. Quentin Rasmussen and Lorelei Hemingford Chase completed 2 more expeditions in Wyoming ranges before taking a year-long sabbatical to produce an educational documentary about their experiences. The climbers themselves gained new perspective on their place in the wilderness hierarchy, noting in the closing segment of their documentary that sometimes, even for experienced mountaineers, the only appropriate response to nature is patient, humble stillness. The cabin stood silent beneath the low cloud cover, surrounded by the thick woods of Sakhalin Island. It was early morning on May 24th, 2025. Mist drifted low across the mossy ground as salmon-filled streams pulsed through the forest less than half a mile away. The Airbnb listing had promised tranquility, a rustic escape from city noise, for 3 friends: Mikhail, 38, a quiet software developer; Igor, 41, a rugged outdoorsman turned online host; and Artyom, 33, a school teacher recovering from burnout. It was meant to be a weekend of rest, campfire stories, and good food, but they had left food scraps in the trash can near the back door. Some packaging had been tossed behind the cabin after a late barbecue. They hadn't thought much of it. None of them imagined a bear might catch the scent. None of them remembered the host's warning printed near the cabin's entrance: "Secure all food. Grizzlies frequent the area." At 4:27 a.m., Mikhail woke first to a sound he couldn't place: a low, dragging scrape, then a sharp knock, like wood splintering. It echoed from the back of the cabin. He sat up slowly in the darkness, heart suddenly hammering. A few seconds later, the sharp bang came again, louder now. Then the wood cracked. Something heavy crashed into the door. On the 3rd strike, it exploded inward. Cold air burst into the small space. The dim moonlight framed a huge silhouette that ducked into the cabin. A massive Russian grizzly, its fur wet and matted, shoulders hunched like a charging tank. It moved fast, too fast for them to react. The bear surged forward, heading straight toward the small kitchen table where Igor had left his backpack filled with jerky and other snacks. In its fury, the animal knocked over a chair, smashing it into the wall. The noise woke Igor and Artyom just as the bear turned, catching their movement. The attack began in an instant. The bear lunged at Igor first, batting him aside with one enormous paw. Igor hit the floor hard, back scraping against a wooden bench. A deep gash split open across his chest where the bear's claws had struck. Blood smeared the wooden planks beneath him as he rolled away, groaning. Mikhail grabbed the metal fire poker beside the wood stove and swung it unthinkingly. The poker struck the bear's flank with a loud metallic thud. It roared in fury, twisting toward the new threat. It knocked Mikhail onto his back and drove a paw across his side. Bones cracked. He screamed as pain exploded through his ribs. The bear reared up, mouth open, fangs flashing, saliva dripping. Pale and trembling, Artyom grabbed the only thing within reach, a broken table leg, and ran toward the bear. He jabbed it into the bear's shoulder, barely piercing the fur, but the distraction worked. The bear turned to him and charged. Artyom didn't run. He ducked low, avoiding the first swipe, but the second struck his thigh and sent him backward. He slammed against the wall and fell in a heap, leg torn open and bleeding fast. The grizzly paced in a tight circle, growling, sniffing at the spilled food and blood. It seemed momentarily confused, surrounded by broken furniture and groaning bodies. Mikhail forced himself up, clutching his ribs. He saw the bear's attention shift toward Igor, who was crawling toward the bedroom. Summoning everything he had, Mikhail released a long, guttural scream and charged with the poker raised. He struck the bear again, this time across the muzzle. The bear roared in pain and rage, whipping its head around, jaws snapping. Mikhail fell back, hands shaking, heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the animal's growls. Igor, bloodied but determined, pulled a flare gun from his backpack inside the room. He aimed it shakily from the doorway. His fingers trembled as he fired. The flare burst with a blinding light and sharp hiss. It struck the cabin ceiling, setting a beam briefly aflame before extinguishing. The bear flinched at the flash, recoiling toward the broken door. It let out a deep growl and backed away, ears flat. The scent of smoke filled the air now, mixing with blood and the musky odor of the animal. The bear lingered one last second, then turned and bounded out into the dark. The silence followed was broken only by their ragged breathing and the creak of wood settling. Blood was everywhere, on the floor, on the walls, soaked into their clothes. Mikhail collapsed onto a chair, ribs screaming in pain. Artyom moaned softly from the wall. Igor clutched his torn chest and stared at the doorway. They didn't know if it would come back. They spent the next hour securing the cabin as best they could. Mikhail propped the stove against the destroyed doorway. Igor used a rope to tie furniture together in front of the opening. Artyom drifted in and out of consciousness, his leg bandaged with torn sheets. They wrapped their wounds as best they could and waited for dawn. The emergency beacon on Igor's phone finally caught a signal just before 6. A rescue helicopter didn't arrive until after 10. By then the cold had worsened the bleeding, and none could stand. The rescuers found them weak, battered, and barely coherent. All three were hospitalized in Yuzhno-Sakhalinsk. None suffered life-threatening injuries, though Mikhail needed surgery for cracked ribs and a punctured lung. Artyom underwent skin grafts. Igor, with the deepest claw wounds, bore long scars down his chest. The attack shocked local authorities and made national news. The cabin, advertised to tourists as a peaceful wilderness retreat, had not been properly inspected for bear safety. Food had not been stored in sealed containers, and no bear-proof garbage bins were present. The back door had been weakened by moisture and rot, barely enough to keep out wind, let alone a bear. Debates erupted about Airbnb safety standards in rural Russia. Conservationists pointed to the salmon streams and early bear activity in May as predictable risks. Others demanded tighter regulations for cabins near bear territory, especially concerning food storage and reinforced entryways. For Mikhail, Igor, and Artyom, it became a nightmare they would never forget. The sounds, the roar, the crash, the wet thud of claws against flesh haunted their sleep. They had come seeking peace. Instead, they found the raw violence of nature waiting just beyond the walls,